This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Oxygen. Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen. If someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, so that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I've just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. No one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there.
What do we do?
You know what? Why don't we just set this up as a little mobile hospital unit right here, okay?
Hold on to tie against all units that are available. We're heading to the new command post on Murray Street and West Street. Any units available, report it when you're all up to this.
We have a report now that a large plane crashed this morning north of the Somerset County Airport, which is in western Pennsylvania, not too terribly far from Pittsburgh, about 80 miles or so.
I don't think there are enough words in the English language, or there are enough appropriate words to describe the range of emotions that I think Pennsylvanians share with their neighbors in Virginia, New York, and the rest of America after literally witnessing the most brutal act of terrorism perhaps in mankind, at least in recent history.
This is CNN.
The day after a massive and unprecedented terrorist attack on America, a nation mourns.
A major recovery effort is underway in Lower Manhattan right now, a search for thousands of innocent victims and hundreds of their rescuers who were lost in the destruction.
And good morning, I'm Vince Giulini along with Carol Lynn, and Lower Manhattan this morning lying in a mountain of rubble fewer than 24 hours after the world's worst ever terrorist attack.
That's right, Vince. Efforts are underway at this hour right now to find what is feared to be thousands of victims. Now, here are some of the latest pictures, and as you can see, heavy equipment is now on the scene for helping.
Among the victims, more than 300 firefighters are missing, feared dead. They were among the first crews to enter the World Trade Center area after the initial plane crashes.
We also have new pictures of those terrible moments when two passenger jets became missiles aimed at the Twin Towers.
Oh, shit!
More than 20 hours later, it is still seemingly unbelievable that this even happened. CNN's Garrick Utley is live in New York for the latest on the rescue operation. Garrick, do we yet know how many people survived, how many people died?
We can't even begin to speculate on that, Carol. The mayor, other government officials have said they're not even to try to guess, although the figure will obviously be in the thousands. It's now just after 5 a.m. as you well know, here on the East Coast of the United States, here in New York City. And this is the time that this metropolis usually starts to come to work, get up and get at it in the New York way, but not this morning. Nobody's really coming into town. The streets, even at this hour, are still empty. The only sounds we hear is the occasional siren of an ambulance or a police car racing around Manhattan Island. The rescue work, as we saw just a moment ago, is continuing. It has been going on all night down at the World Trade Center site. The generators or the floodlights were brought in. The fire department is still there. Rescue workers are starting to move the rubble, the giant earth-moving machine. But of course, this is going to go on for days and days. And what is really hard for many, I think, of us to understand or comprehend, that what seems to have been a trauma that has gone on for an eternity has really been with us for, what, 20 hours now. And it started under such different circumstances.
It was such a beautiful morning. The air was clear over Manhattan, the sky a rich blue. The two twin towers stood tall, anchored in bedrock of granite, so secure, so unshakable. And then, we have seen smoke and destruction before, but we've never seen madness like this, or catastrophe like this. It was a morning when words could only begin to express the horror.
It was like a blizzard, but a blizzard that wasn't cold, a blizzard that had no wind. It was just hot.
There was an enormous fireball. There was fire, debris falling to the ground, and then just a whole kind of mushroom of smoke that sort of just billowed up.
We knew that some of what happened this morning could happen, that there could be another attack on the World Trade Center as there was 8 years ago, that terrorists might attack the Pentagon and hijack commercial flights. But how could we imagine that all this could happen? That much of the government would be shut down, the capital of the United States evacuated, and the White House, that the president of the most powerful nation in the world would take evasive action for his own security. Across this nation, from airports closed down to home to workplace, we watched and tried to comprehend what we were seeing. It took time after the shock of the terror to digest the dimension of the human tragedy. We tried to imagine what those caught in the soaring towers, in the doomed planes in the Pentagon went through before the end. We can only wonder what happens next. The president vows action.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
Retaliation, even revenge, may feel sweet one day, but right now there are only the remnants of terror, the pain of the tragedy, and the tears.
And now there is the morning after and the days to come, and the morning newspaper, another one, has reached Manhattan Island, New York's Daily News, the largest circulating tabloid in the United States, the oldest one too. The headline is simply, "It's War," in red letters, pictures throughout the newspaper as throughout the other journals coming out of this city and across the country this day. Really telling us nothing new, except that it's war. The question, of course, Carol, is if we know where the battleground is. It was right down here in Lower Manhattan. It was in the Pentagon today or yesterday. The search there continues. The question is, where is the enemy? And that's what we will be asking for days and weeks to come.
Certainly.
Carol?
And how do we find the enemy? Thank you very much, Garrick Utley, reporting from New York. We will get to that matter in just a moment, but right now we want to talk about the recovery operation. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says hospitals have so far treated 1,100 people. Catholic Cardinal Edward Egan arrived at St. Vincent's Hospital to administer last rites to a dozen victims. CNN's Michael Oku is monitoring the situation at St. Vincent's, and he joins us now live. Michael.
Carol, in a couple hours, most New Yorkers will awake in a city with a gaping hole in its skyline. But there is absolutely no lack of compassion or empathy in many of the people at this scene on this night. Walking along, I should say that many of the pedestrians here at St. Vincent's Hospital, which of course has become the main triage center here in New York, have greeted each other with knowing nods, which, as you can imagine, is not common practice here in New York. It's been a very strangely silent night. Just north of here, a couple blocks on 14th Street, the police department has set up barricades, and that's limiting the traffic just south of 14th Street to residents, police vehicles, and occasionally emergency medical vehicles whose sirens occasionally punctuate and break the eerie silence. Now, about 40 minutes ago, we saw 3 victims, and in fact, in the last 1 minute, we saw a 4th victim who we identified as a police officer. They were rushed into the hospital, but it is unclear whether any of those victims sustained injuries associated with the World Trade Center attack. Hospital officials here at St. Vincent's said that they have admitted 327 patients associated with the attack, 50 to 55 of whom were in critical condition as of 10:30 last night, Eastern Time. Many of those victims sustained severe burns, many of those burns to the face. Officials say that they will have another briefing at about 6:30 this morning, and we will be here, of course, live for that. Back to you, Carol.
All right, thank you very much. Michael Oku, outside of St. Vincent's Hospital this morning. It could be weeks before we know the absolute total number of people who were injured and killed. And of course, the hunt for suspects does go on. Last night, President Bush, in an Oval Office address, promised to hunt down those responsible, denounced this failed attempt, as he called it, to scare the United States. But what are the administration's options? Former State Department spokesman and former Assistant Secretary to the State Department, James Rubin, joins us now from our London bureau. Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning to you.
Well, certainly Americans will be waking up this morning asking, how could this possibly happen? And we have learned that just last month, security officials had warned about Osama bin Laden's threat to American installations overseas. Just last Friday, the State Department issued travel warnings to Americans. So how is it that the American intelligence community failed to detect that something like this could happen?
Well, I suspect that is the $64,000 question that's going to be examined day after day by the committees of Congress, by the intelligence community itself, and by the administration. Clearly, what we've seen is an attack not just on the United States, but on the nerve center of the civilized world, which is what the World Trade Center is. And I think in terms of the administration's options that you mentioned earlier, I think first and foremost, they're going to have to nail down if this really was Osama bin Laden. It certainly has all the fingerprints of an Osama bin Laden or his followers' attack. It follows closely on ideas that were discussed in previous attacks, namely to take over jetliners and crash them into American facilities. It follows on their attempt to destroy the World Trade Center before. So it has all the fingerprints of Osama bin Laden. I think the important point that President Bush stressed last night is that we are not going to allow governments to come up with ridiculous arguments, such as the Afghanistan government, that somehow Osama bin Laden, who's masterminding these attacks, is a guest of their country and therefore can't be turned over. We're now at war. The lower part of Manhattan is a war zone. The United States has never been attacked like this before. It looks, unfortunately, like it may be on the scale of Pearl Harbor in terms of the deaths of Americans by surprise. And Americans are going to respond to that war. And the key question is whether the President of the United States is going to be able to gather the civilized countries of the world, all of them, one by one, putting the question to them, are you on the side of the civilized peoples, the peoples who believe in not just freedom, but in safety and security, or are you going to be on the side of these evil terrorists? And that diplomatic campaign has already begun, and it's going to be an enormous challenge, because there's no way to combat this kind of terrorism and prevent it from happening again without the support of large numbers of countries in the world.
Which raises another question, Jamie. How far should the United States go in going after sympathetic governments who might be supporting Osama bin Laden? Of course, you know that it's thought that he's being harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So even with a united front, what options do the administration have in going after the Taliban?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the Taliban are harboring Osama bin Laden. They've been doing so for some years now. I don't think there's any question that there are other individuals around the world who have been part and parcel of his fundraising apparatus and who have given aid and comfort to this enemy of the United States. In terms of military options, economic options, diplomatic options, at this point I think it would be premature for me to say, except to say that when people talk about military action, it should not be thought about as retribution. It should be thought about as preemption. This organization has acted before, time after time, against the World Trade Center, against the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, against the USS Cole. If indeed they acted yesterday, as it looks like they did, they are going to act again. And the use of military force is not for some retribution or revenge, if it comes to that. It's to deter and preempt them from acting another time and killing even more people than we've seen in the last 24 hours.
So, Jamie, take us into the process then. Take us into behind the scenes at the National Security Operation and at the State Department. What discussions are being had today? Who is sitting at the table? And what decisions are likely needed to be made in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Well, I think on the domestic side, obviously, the emergency system is going to be put in place to try to help the city of New York and the state of New York deal with its tragedy in Lower Manhattan and obviously the tragedy at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. On the foreign policy side, the national security side, I think the first order of business is to determine if there are any other potential capabilities for these terrorists to take over aircraft again. And I think by stopping the flights and changing the security apparatus by which pilots operate will be prime on the agenda. On the diplomatic side, I think what will be happening is that the Secretary of State or his representative now, I gather he's flying back from Peru, will be asked to canvass the world's governments to try to ascertain the level of support we're getting from all of the key countries. We need a coalition against terrorism, and that coalition has to be more than just our NATO allies who are committed by treaty to defend the United States if it comes under attack, but also countries like Russia and moderate Arab states and other countries, perhaps even the Chinese, to commit with us in this battle against terrorism, so that if the Osama bin Laden organization is proved to be responsible, that those countries support us in whatever measures we need to take, not to act in revenge, but to act to prevent them from doing it again to another civilized country, because this is just the beginning of what they see as a permanent campaign against the United States and the civilized world. So I think all of those steps are being taken. And finally, there is a reassurance that has to take place, and I think President Bush has done a good job so far, but he and his administration need to do an even better job today, tomorrow, and in the weeks to come to reassure not only the American people that all these steps are being taken, but to reassure the financial markets, to make clear that the United States nerve center of commerce in Wall Street may have been attacked, but our nerves are made of steel, and we're going to go forward and continue our daily business in the business of America, because that's what these terrorists are trying to prevent. And he needs to convince every American citizen that they need to get up in the morning and do all the things they used to do, and do them perhaps with more care and more caution, but to not let the terrorists win by changing our freedoms or changing our habits.
James Rubin, former State Department spokesman from London. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Washington, D.C. was in the crosshairs of terrorism. Senior White House correspondent John King and national correspondent Bob Franken on the scene for us this morning in the nation's capital. First, let's go to John King. John.
Well, Vince, in the hours ahead, look for the administration to move aggressively on several fronts. First, an effort by the White House to to make the case the federal government is doing all it can for the rescue and the relief operation. As part of that, there will even be a symbolic blood drive on the White House grounds this morning. Also, Secretary of State Colin Powell will be out making the round of morning news shows, also delivering remarks here in Washington, promising a thorough investigation and promising, as Jamie Rubin was just speaking about, to reach out to governments around the world to build a new coalition against international terrorism. Now, the president will awake this morning and be briefed once again by his national security team. He will also have a bipartisan meeting with the congressional leadership at the White House and deliver some public remarks after that statement. That, an effort by the White House to show continuity and resolve that the government is at work, even as the investigation and the rescue and relief efforts unfold. Now, Mr. Bush last night delivered a nationally televised address to the nation, certainly a defining moment for this president on a defining day for the country. Mr. Bush, speaking to the American people from the Oval Office, said the nation was gripped by what he called a quiet, unyielding anger.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
Now, Mr. Bush also said as the investigation continues, the United States would make, quote, no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them. The administration publicly saying the investigation continues privately, though, we are told, at a national security briefing at the White House last night, as well as in private briefings to key members of Congress. Senior administration officials are saying that they are confident the evidence collected so far points to the suspected Saudi terrorist Osama bin Laden and associates and organizations affiliated with him. The administration promising to take retaliation when its investigation is completed. One official I spoke to last night after this meeting said they were going to take their time. This official saying they wanted to make sure they sorted this out before acting. Again, look for more words from the president later this morning after he receives an update on the latest on the investigation, as well as the relief and rescue operations underway at the Pentagon and in New York City. Vince?
Well, John, in reading some of the information you've transmitted to us overnight, United Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania, may have had a more specific target. I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Still some speculation involved in this, but we are told that law enforcement officials and other administration officials in their briefings to key members of Congress said that based on the information they have so far, they believe that that plane was turning south, heading toward Washington. Three possible targets. One, the presidential retreat of Camp David outside of Washington in Maryland. More likely, though, according to our sources, the White House or the U.S. Capitol. They believe that plane was ultimately headed for Washington. No explanation yet as to why it crashed in Pennsylvania, but that is what we are told. Key members of Congress are being told as the investigation unfolds. At least so far, they believe that the target for that plane was here in Washington. Vince?
White House senior correspondent John King, thank you very much. We'll be checking in with you throughout these early morning hours and into daylight on Wednesday. Well, the Pentagon is the nation's military nerve center and an important symbol of U.S. strength. On Tuesday, September 11, 2001, it was a target. Officials now say as many as 800 employees died in the attack on the Pentagon. CNN national correspondent Bob Franken is here with the latest. Bob?
Well, this morning, when regular business hours occur, there's going to be an attempt at a small victory. That is to say that the Defense Secretary has ordered that parts of the building that can be open for business will be open for business. That is a small victory over the big loss of yesterday when a plane crashed into it. You can see it in the back of me. We're going to find out, or start to find out as the day unfolds, just how significant, how big that loss is. Once daybreak occurs, officials are going to check to see if the fire has receded enough that they can go into the building, start combing through the rubble, and finding out in human terms just how many casualties there were. That, of course, is going to be an extended process. The Pentagon has just steadfastly refused to give away any information about the number of people who they expect might have been killed. They're talking about figures that might go into the hundreds, although the Pentagon says that some estimates that have gone as high as 800 may be far too high, but they're going to find the grim task of doing that. They're going to start that this morning. Business is still going on at the Pentagon. There is still military planning going on. There are some efforts, in fact, to make sure that the United States remains protected on both coasts. Flotillas of military ships, including aircraft carriers, have been sent to sea on both the east and west coast and along the coast of Hawaii to protect against any contingency. Nothing is expected in particular, but of course, this tragic day was not expected yesterday. Vince?
Bob, before we let you go, President Bush talked about how important it was to have business go on as usual. You touched on this. And how important is it to show some semblance of order, things taking place as they should at the Pentagon?
Well, it's going to be difficult to do that. It's quite interesting. Only about half of this building is really considered safe enough to conduct business, although, of course, it was not half that was really wiped out by the airplane that crashed into it. You can see in back of me there were 3 of the corridors that were hit. There is actually 17 miles of corridors in the Pentagon, and about half of that is going to be considered structurally unsafe, at least not proven to be safe, but that other half is going to be open for business. That is the half that will include so many of the vital functions here, the Military Command Center, the offices of the top-ranking people, the secretaries and deputy secretaries. Business will be going on there, and of course, it's business in time of crisis.
Thank you very much. CNN national correspondent Bob Franken.
Well, Vince, amid the chaos in New York and Washington, there was another hijacking and plane crash, and this time it was in Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in a field near Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board, and no one survived.
What we're doing is maintaining the scene. We have 150 troopers, both mounted on horseback and on foot, in 2 separate perimeters, keeping the scene as pristine as possible. Protect it for the further investigation and to make sure that no one is injured through a biohazard or wants to get into the crime scene.
And just a few minutes ago, John King reported that government sources are telling CNN United Flight 93 was likely headed for a government target, possibly the White House, the Capitol, or even Camp David.
Well, so many people have outpourings of emotion. We'd like to hear from you, and to do that, you can contact us by email at this address, daybreak@cnn.com. Please include your name and where you are writing from, and this might be an opportunity for you to express your views on this terrible, terrible turn of events.
Also, as a service to our viewers, Vince, some of you might want to grab a pen or pencil. Throughout the day, we're going to be broadcasting telephone numbers where you can call for information about passengers, flights, that sort of thing. So these numbers will run throughout the morning, so go ahead and prepare for that if you need to. Also, a handful of people who died in the plane crashes had one last chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. In fact, one man called his family in San Francisco from United Flight 93.
That I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Giving me his last name. And he said, I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying. I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the air phone of the airplane.
In his seat?
I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of it's true, and then the phone went dead.
Her son, Mark Bingham, was on the flight that crashed in that field near Pittsburgh. Now, John Ogonowski was the captain of American Airlines Flight 11, and his plane crashed into one of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. His family spoke out yesterday.
I ask all of you for your prayers for, as I refer to him, as Brother John. And I ask you to also pray for our whole country today in this tragedy that's impacting our whole country.
Mr. Oganowski leaves a wife and 3 daughters. Vince?
4 planes hijacked and brought down in one day. It has many questioning the safety of the sky. Paul Baum is the editor of Aviation Security International, a former security chief at TWA, and he joins us from London this morning. Good morning, Mr. Baum.
Good morning to you.
Sir, this is the question that many Americans are asking right now. How could this happen? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked in the morning? And it's just beyond belief. How did it happen?
Absolutely, it is an absolute tragedy, the real nightmare scenario for the aviation security industry and, of course, for the American people and the world as a whole. The only thing that could have been worse would have been if it had been a chemical or biological attack on one of these cities. It would appear that the real failing has been on the intelligence side in preventing these incidents. In the past, intelligence has worked. You only have to go back to 1995 when American intelligence basically thwarted, in what was known as the Bojinga plot, the blowing up of 12 American airliners on one single day. That day, American intelligence worked. September the 11th, 2001, unfortunately, it all fell apart. And the pictures that we've all been witnessing are those of really of a war scene. You could have been seeing those pictures of the Balkans or of the Middle East, and yet this was downtown Manhattan, downtown Washington. And that just sort of reminds me of...
Excuse me, Mr. Baum, you talked about the overall picture and intelligence, but what about the basics of airport security? And that is, these people commandeering a plane. Would we be shocked at how easily that can be done and how easily it might have been done yesterday?
I'd love to say that I was shocked. Truth is, I wasn't. I was shocked by the outcome and the fact that probably at least 12 people could have decided to go to their deaths in such a tragic manner and killing so many other innocent people in the process. Yes, airport security procedures are going to have to be reviewed, especially domestically in the United States. I don't think it's a surprise that they targeted American Airlines and United Airlines, basically the 2 giants of the aviation industry. It used to be Pan Am and TWA. It's no surprise that they targeted flights that were going to the West Coast, to San Francisco and Los Angeles, so that on impact, those planes would have been carrying far more fuel than any other aircraft in the sky, so the impact would have been that much greater. But certainly domestic aviation security is going to have to be reviewed. But that said, it's not such an easy thing to do. In Europe, we have a situation where only the passengers can go to the gates. In the United States, as many of your viewers will be well aware, anybody meeting or greeting passengers can go through the security checkpoints and up to the gates, meaning that there's an increased stress on the screeners.
Mr. Baum, maybe as a security expert, you can tell us exactly what pilots and flight attendants are instructed to do in case of an emergency, in case of a hijacking. What are their immediate instructions procedurally?
Well, the procedures, unlike mechanical failures, are basically to evaluate the type of hijacker. There are 4 different types of hijackers. There are criminals, there are terrorists, there are asylum seekers, and there are the insane or the mentally disturbed. This may be a combination of different types, but you have to react to the type of hijacker you have. Now, if, as we're led to believe, that these were very violent people who simply got out of their seats and started slashing flight attendants, then there is only so much that one can do, and one would have expected them to have just sort of gone back to their natural survival instincts and done whatever they could possibly do to survive. What I do not believe was the case.
Go ahead, sir. Excuse me. Go ahead.
So I certainly don't believe that it was the pilots themselves, even at knife point or gunpoint, that would have intentionally flown their aircraft into the Twin Towers or into the Pentagon.
You mentioned this briefly, you touched on this, but what will this mean for the future, security-wise, for commercial airlines? What can you see maybe immediately and through the first few months after this situation?
Well, certainly, I mean, there's already been an increase to to threat code Delta in the United States. So security is basically at its highest level of alert once the planes go back in the skies. But that said, so there won't be things like curbside check-in. There will be restricting access to the gate areas. But I think that it's possibly taken an incident like this to prove that domestic security has to be treated the same way as international security on international flights. In other words, that there needs to be positive passenger bag match, that if you check a bag in for a flight, that you travel on that flight, that only passengers go to the gate areas, and certainly that the identification checks that are carried out by the check-in agents are going to be much more stringent. That said, I don't think we need to focus solely on screening of passengers. This was a very well orchestrated attack. This involved insiders, either in the airlines or in the airports. Certainly there are reports coming through this morning from Boston that, of people with contacts in the UAE with flight manuals were found in a car in Boston. These people knew what they were doing. They probably had very good contacts, and they didn't necessarily go through the passenger screening points.
All right, Philip Baum, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Vince, as dawn begins to break over the East Coast, we take you now live for what for many of you could be the first look here on this day after of this devastating terrorist attack. The gap in the sky where you are looking is where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. The New York skyline completely changed this morning as hundreds of firefighters are going through the rubble, trying to find if there are any survivors, trying to count the dead. We may not know for weeks how many people died in this attack on one of America's most significant financial power centers. And then on to Washington now, where we have this devastating scene of the Pentagon. There you see the collapsed area of the building where a passenger jet plowed through to the inner circle of the Pentagon. Once again, rescue operations there underway. As many as 800 or more Pentagon employees may have died in this attack. We are covering this throughout the day, but in the meantime, of course, Garrett Uckley on the scene in New York, reviewing the damage, counting the losses. Garrett?
And Carol, also at this moment, we want to take a few moments and think about some of the heroes in today's tragedy or yesterday's tragedy. Of course, we don't know how many they were and what was happening in that airplane that crashed in Pennsylvania or in the Pentagon offices or even here in Lower Manhattan. But we do know this. We do know that 80 or more members of the New York City Police Department, men and women, are missing and feared lost. We know that 300 or perhaps even more members of the New York City Fire Department are missing or lost. Who were they? They were people doing their jobs. They were the ones this morning or yesterday morning who were racing into those Twin Towers to save people, going up the stairwells while everybody else was racing out, and they raced into a trap. Here's a report from correspondent Deborah Farrick.
Many of the 300 firefighters missing and feared dead were believed to be inside the World Trade Center when it collapsed.
When I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just it's a devastating thing. I don't know. Well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Arriving first on scene, they ran into the burning towers, carrying hoses and trying to get people to safety.
The horror of it all was all the first alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fifth alarm companies. They were all in there. And there's a lot of companies that wiped out from what I understand.
Fire engines were crushed, a strategic command center silenced, and several of the highest-ranking fire officials buried beneath tons of dust and steel.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Those who got out in time went back, injuries and all, to search for their friends. Others off duty grabbed their gear and raced to help dig out any possible survivors.
My brother works in the 91st floor. My brother, and he's unaccounted for at this time. So I'm just, doing a lot of praying.
Praying amidst an unnatural silence.
That's probably what amazed me the most. There was no people to be seen. Even the dogs couldn't find people.
At firehouses in Manhattan, there were flowers and mourning as everyone waited, holding out hope.
They should have been here already. The rig is not back. They're not back. They should have been back.
More than 30 police officers also died. Choking back tears, several firefighters summed up the catastrophe.
These are your buddies.
We lost a lot of friends today. a lot of friends.
A loss that will be shared by all New Yorkers. Deborah Fayrick, CNN, New York.
And now we have some of the names of the four most high-ranking members of the New York City Fire Department. We'd like to mention them to you because we're getting so few names of victims in yesterday's disaster. Peter Ganci, the Fire Department Chief. William Feehan, First Deputy Commissioner of the Fire Department. Ray Downey, Chief of Special Operations Command. And the Reverend Michael Judge, the New York Fire Department chaplain, missing and feared lost down in Lower Manhattan today. What more can we say? What are New Yorkers waking up to? Well, now they're waking up to their morning newspapers, and now the New York Times is there. That says it all. U.S. attacked, the picture, and the stories of what happened. Today's headline, a headline that will not be forgotten. And back to you now, Carol and Vince in Atlanta.
Certainly not the pictures that we're seeing and continue to see. Garrick, Deborah Fayrick was reporting on what she called an unnatural silence in this city that never sleeps. What is the scene below you? What is the city like compared to how it would normally be at this very early morning hour?
Well, at this morning hour, it'll be pretty busy. 5:40, the workers will be pouring into town already, even before the sun has come up behind me here to the east. We have the streets, as you can see, which are empty. Some of them in Lower Manhattan are sealed off, but the streets around us at 34th Street, traffic is being allowed, or some traffic at least. However, when you look over to the east of us, just 2 blocks away, there's an Empire State Building that's shrouded in darkness right now. But we're told that the streets around the Empire State Building have been sealed off, as has the headquarters of the United Nations on the East River, which was evacuated on Tuesday. The fact is that these are obviously 2 prime targets, 2 big high-rises, 2 of the biggest buildings in New York City. The fear is that there may be more terrorists out there somewhere, perhaps with a car bomb, and so security will continue to be totally tight during this day.
Sure. So what are you hearing in terms of how people are going to deal with their day? Are people going to try to get into the city, try to go to work, try to go about their business?
No, I don't think they are. They've been told, first of all, stay away from town if you don't have essential, absolutely critical business here. The bridges are closed to vehicular traffic, except for the George Washington Bridge, which may have just 1 lane under very strict control. So are the tunnels. Airports, of course, are closed. Much of the rail traffic has been shut down. Schools, private, public, parochial schools will be closed. The stock exchanges will be closed. Times Square, Broadway will be closed. No traditional Wednesday matinee performances tomorrow. So life is going to be very, very slow, very, very difficult. And one added little indication of how life changes here and the concern over security, Carol, right below us down here at 33rd Street, about 15 stories below us here, is the Central Post Office of New York City. This is not only the Central Post Office in the city, it's the zip code 10001. From pride taken by people in this 10001 zip code area. Well, the mail will go through, but on top of that post office is inscribed a famous saying about how no sleet or rain or storm or snow or whatever it's going to be will delay the letter carrier in carrying out his appointed rounds. Well, they'll be out tomorrow, but not totally, because tomorrow there will be no pickups from the Postal Service mailbox on the streets of New York City. The reason, obviously, the concern that some terrorist might put a bomb in a package and try to mail it off. They'll be closed and sealed.
Tomorrow already being today, as we look at the scene now, and it looks like the sky is beginning to glow with possibility of the sun rising on this devastation. Garrick, also, I heard that some 3,000 National Guardsmen are going to be deployed throughout the city. Potentially, New Yorkers could be waking up to armed guards standing on their street corners.
Well, armed guards, the 3,000 mobilized by Governor Pataki have been moved in. They're there to supplement the police department, which is obviously stressed and overburdened. You can't maintain full force 24 hours a day. So yes, we expect to see them there. There has been, this must be emphasized, no indication of security or increase in crime or looting or anything like this. For all the chaos we've seen today or yesterday and the human misery which continues today, the fact is that people have been amazingly orderly and disciplined in their behavior. And I think people in this city, in this metropolis, are taking a great deal of pride in that. So the National Guardsmen and women will be here, but there's no real security problem of that nature in the streets of New York today.
Yeah, and certainly we expect to see that typical New York can-do spirit. I don't know about you, but yesterday, as I was watching these pictures on the monitor, I was going through a mental Rolodex as to who I knew in New York, where they were working, did I know anybody in the World Trade Center? If people have those questions, what should they do? Yesterday, the telephone companies and the authorities were saying, please lay off the telephone lines. We need to keep those clear. What are the instructions for people if they're still trying to get information? What should they do?
Well, there are a number of lines that have been set up, 800 lines and other lines, not just by the government and officials here, but also by individual companies. There are scores of companies that have enormous businesses in the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Some of these financial companies had 10, 20, even 22 or 25 floors filled with employees. They have set up their own hotlines, their own emergency lines to allow families and friends to call them. And that's about the only way we're really going to know or get an early estimate as to how many casualties there have been in this tragedy. It'll take weeks to get the remains out, the bodies out, but if a census can be done, in fact a de facto nose counting of who is still around, who can be reached and who isn't, then perhaps by the end of today we'll get a rough idea of how many missing there are among the civilians, non-city employees working in the Twin Towers, and the full scope and human cost of this tragedy in New York City will begin to be known.
Boy, we're just seeing some closer up pictures of the devastation down there by the World Trade Center. Firefighters going through some of that wreckage. It does look like a war zone, and I'm wondering, are people facing any sorts of shortages there, any food shortages, fuel shortages?
Well, I ran out earlier last night to get a quick sandwich, walked into a diner here on 34th Street and said, give me a cheeseburger. And he says, no hamburgers. I said, no hamburgers? He says, no hamburgers delivered today. All deliveries have stopped. I said, what do you have? And he had some soup and a salad, and that was it. But that's a minor incident. There are no signs of serious shortages. However, if the tunnels and bridges are kept close to general delivery by trucks of foods, then in a day or two, you could have shortages. However, I would imagine, nobody said this officially, that by the end of business of this day, I think city officials will want to get traffic moving again, commerce moving again, and supplies coming into Manhattan, which after all is an island with only a few bridges across the East River and a couple of tunnels and a bridge across the Hudson here. This is an island, and the drawbridges have been drawn up.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki were saying yesterday, they want calm on the streets, but I think they also want a show of faith in their administration and a show of faith in the firefighters and the police officers who are responding, the National Guardsmen and women who are going to be responding and on the street corners. New Yorkers seem to have risen to the occasion. I haven't heard much about looting or crime going on.
No, we said that, just mentioned that the fact is that there is no reports of looting of any sort, and certainly the opportunities were there in Lower Manhattan. Businesses were being closed, the merchants were racing away to save themselves, owners of shops just as everybody else was today. But we've had no indication of that, and again, people take great pride in that. I think what people are going to be doing here, as those across the nation and around the world watching these scenes right now, these big earth-moving machines are going to work down there in Lower Manhattan, is to really spend this Wednesday, as many as possible, at home. Yes, trying to find out what's happened to friends or relatives who might have been trapped in the trade towers, the two towers, and the third building which collapsed next door to it. And just pray and hope for the best. That's the spirit. That's not New York spirit alone. That's human spirit.
The human spirit, absolutely, under trying times. Thank you so much, Garrett Utley, reporting live from New York at our New York Bureau. Vince?
The day after the attack will no doubt be a long one in Washington, where U.S. leaders are deciding what the next step will be. And joining us now live again is CNN senior White House correspondent John King. And John, what do we expect President Bush, will do today?
Well, Vince, let me start first by saying just in the past few minutes, we have seen the lights come on in the White House residence behind me. On a normal day, the president generally rises between 5 and 5:20 a.m. every day to begin his day. This, of course, anything but a normal day, but some activity already at the White House. We are told by senior administration officials the president will, once he reports to work at the Oval Office, receive an update on the latest on the investigation, as well as the rescue and recovery efforts underway, as well as the diplomatic efforts by the State Department and others to reach out to key allies and other governments around the world for their assessment of this great tragedy. And then the president, very determined, much like we just heard from Garrett Gutley in New York, very determined, even as the investigation, even as the rescue operations go underway, to show some sense of continuity, some sense of the government at work. The president will bring major congressional leaders down to the White House later this morning. They will deliver public remarks trying to reassure the American people that as the investigation continues and as the government promises to find out who did this and bring those parties to justice, that the business of the government will go on.
John, when we are threatened, and certainly we've never seen anything like this, but does the White House assemble, for lack of a better term, a usual suspects list? And are we moving any closer to clues as to who might be responsible for this?
Well, certainly the White House has a usual suspect list that begins because of the sophistication of these attacks. 4 planes hijacked at the same time. Obviously, some of the people aboard those planes being able to pilot them. The White House saying all signs point to, and we know from, again, from briefings given by senior administration officials to key members of Congress, they are saying that they believe that they are collecting credible evidence pointing to associates and affiliates of Osama bin Laden. They also caution us that they want to continue this investigation. And as that plays out, there are always fears. One of the reasons the president did not come directly back to Washington yesterday, there were fears of a follow-up round of attacks. At one point, they had not accounted for all of the planes in the skies over the United States. They did not want the president flying back until they had done so. Remarkable security all day yesterday here in Washington around the president. Air Force One had fighter jets flying in very close proximity to it. And overnight here in Washington, there has been a great debate in recent years about the decision a few years back to close Pennsylvania Avenue to car traffic, whether that was an intrusion on the public's rights to move about here in Washington, to see the sights of the Capitol. Overnight here in the Capitol, Vince, blocks away from the White House, police, Secret Service, even U.S. military Humvee vehicles setting up a perimeter much farther around the White House than we are used to seeing. You can be certain in the days and weeks ahead, security on high alert here in Washington. We're also told throughout the country, especially at airports and train stations and at U.S. embassies and military installations overseas as well.
Yeah, I don't think any question about that. As we look at this and we try to somehow make some semblance of sense of it all, intelligence questions are arising, and Secretary of State Colin Powell said there were, quote, no specific warnings. As the White House and officials try to backtrack a little bit, are they doing that now, trying to see if maybe something was missed, something they could have acted on?
They certainly will do that, and they certainly are doing that. Their primary focus, especially in what they say and what they do in public right now, is on the relief and recovery effort and on the investigation. But make no mistake about it, we heard it throughout the day yesterday from administration officials, as well as especially from key members of Congress, people asking how could this have happened? How could 4 commercial airliners be hijacked? How could there be no evidence at all that such an attack was being planned? A great number of questions about the efficiency of U.S. intelligence services, a great deal of criticism from key members of Congress yesterday, a great number of promises from key members of Congress to look ahead once we get past the dire days ahead of us as we deal, there you see the picture of the Pentagon, as we deal with repair and recovery, assessing the toll of the casualties and getting on with the investigation. A great number of promises from key members of the Congress to look once again, perhaps all raising the question, are the CIA and other agencies that do this human intelligence, are they underfunded? Are they doing things wrong? How might this have been prevented? Could it have been prevented?
Boy, the questions just continue. Senior correspondent John King, thank you very much for the update, Carol.
Vince, as John King has been reporting, and as we spoke to James Rubin earlier today, what President Bush is looking for is support internationally for the fight against terrorism. So we move overseas now to CNN Chief International Correspondent Christiane Amanpour, who's in London. Christiane, you've been looking at the morning newspapers. What is the read today over there?
Well, Carol, the sense of shock here across this side of the Atlantic is profound, and it seems to be growing, not diminishing, as this unfolding catastrophe becomes more and more clear. In England, for instance, the normally hyperventilating tabloids are saying things like, is this the end of the world? Or that you might expect from these kinds of tabloids, but the otherwise cerebral and normally cautious and careful broadsheets, the Financial Times has got a front page headline entirely devoted to this. They call it Assault on America. Another US British paper calls it Doomsday in America. And here in France, on a leading newspaper, The Figaro, it is saying the new war. all radio and television programs here in the United Kingdom and around Europe that I've heard and that we've been tapping into are almost entirely devoted to this catastrophe. Leaders from all the European countries have spoken publicly about their unlimited support for the United States, not just moral support for the United States and the victims of this catastrophe, but also they pledge themselves publicly to what they say will have to be a renewed effort by all democracies, a worldwide effort, they say, to try to defeat and eradicate this kind of terrorism. In England, certain specific measures have been taken. All commercial airlines are banned from flying over central London. There is heightened security at key areas and key buildings, particularly around the airport. British Airways, the national carrier, has cancelled flights to Pakistan, which neighbors Afghanistan, also to Tel Aviv. You know, Israel has closed down its airspace to any foreign carriers. Air France, the French national carrier, has also banned its flights from going to Tel Aviv, obviously because that airport is closed, but also to North America, while that situation resolves itself in terms of airport closures there. But an intense state of alert and security. All the European governments, most of them, say that they're holding top-level national security meetings today. In Britain, the Prime Minister has convened his top ministers of defense, his Foreign Secretary and his Home Secretary, to an emergency meeting at the Prime Minister's residence. Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, earlier today said that it was perhaps too early to point the specific finger. They said that while they do share intelligence with the United States, he would not reveal that kind of intelligence, although he says that it should not be underestimated the magnitude of what happened in the United States yesterday.
This is an event of such horrifying, unimaginable proportions that I believe it's one where the shock grows over time rather than diminishes, as the reality of it impacts upon all of us, and we come better to understand the appalling consequences obviously for the victims, for their families, for the community in New York, for the people of the United States, and for the world's democratic communities.
Now, while leaders and commentators and analysts are generally saying that a state of war has been declared against the United States and against what they call civilized humanity, they're saying that it is important, Jack Straw saying, to keep a cool head while at the same time realizing and eventually responding to the profound nature of what happened against the targets of democracy and the United States yesterday. Now, in the Arab world, most of the Arab countries who are allied with the United States, most of the moderate Arab countries, the leadership has come out vigorously condemning the attacks yesterday. There is slightly different mood on the streets of the Arab world, where in some capitals and in some parts of the Arab world, people are saying that this was an inevitable eventuality. They say that this is something perhaps that the United States should have expected, given what they say is the U.S. Close association with the State of Israel. And as you know, this 11-month intifada has been ratcheting up anti-American feelings amongst the Arab peoples over the last 11 months. Having said that, Libya, which has not had a history of close relations with the United States, Libya came out condemning what it called this terrorist attack. And today there is word from the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. 57 Islamic nations have come out condemning this attack, saying that it is against Islam. Carol?
Christiane, as you probably know by now, we expect that U.S. domestic flights will begin flying again around midday, although there will be extreme and heightened security at all of the nation's airports. What is the situation in Europe? Are flights going to be resuming, trains resuming, and how tight is security across the board?
Well, security is exceptionally tight, as you can imagine. There were scenes of not chaos, but controlled disruption yesterday at all the airports, with obviously hundreds of passengers trying to get to the United States and people waiting for visitors coming from the United States. And European airlines and air companies are having to deal with many, many stranded passengers as they await news from the United States as to when those airports will be open for operations planes sometime in the not too distant future, they hope. I was flying back from an assignment in Africa yesterday aboard Air France, the French national carrier, and there was an intense security and heightened sense of caution on the flight. The captain, in a rather extraordinary measure, came into the main cabin, took the microphone and asked everybody to be alert, to look around them, to observe whether they noticed anything alarming, different, abnormal, to report anything that they saw that was potentially cause for concern. It was very chilling, it was very tense, it was very stressful. Having said that, Air France takes these kind of security precautions in various tense areas, for instance, the west coast of Africa, and they have private security agents on board who fly on their flights, and not only that, check passengers coming onto the flight. Even once they've been through all the airport security, at the bottom of the plane, at the foot of the steps, they're checked once again, both a body search and a baggage search.
Certainly.
Carol?
Yeah, not unheard of even in normal times. Thank you very much, Christiane Amanpour, reporting live from London. Vince?
Well, you can add the date of September 11, 2001 to those seared into the national consciousness. Pearl Harbor, John Kennedy's assassination, the Oklahoma City bombing, and now this one. 9th month, 11th day, 911, a national emergency. CNN's Ann McDermott tells us how some residents of Southern California reacted to this tragedy.
Everyone watched the TV. Some cried.
Yeah, it was very horrible.
Some raged.
I think we should retaliate and bomb the hell out of them.
And these Los Angeles firefighters watched with particular intensity because so many of their brothers and sisters in New York were dead. Maybe 100 firefighters die in a year across the nation. The figure in this one city, this one day, will be much, much higher.
Anything they need, we're there for them.
The pictures were just so insane that all these University of Southern California students could do was stare. But the younger ones had questions, lots of questions.
But when I first saw on the news, I sort of wondered how protected we really are in America.
Think they'll be able to catch all the people involved?
Their teacher, for once, had no answers.
How? Why? These are the questions.
And here's one more.
Do you think anything like this would ever happen again?
Will it happen again? Psychologists say that's what can make people so crazy at first.
It's not that we're afraid of the unknown. In the face of the unknown, we fill it in. We think there are monsters out there, and we actually end up frightening ourselves more.
Did the president's speech help?
I thought his point that, that they can knock the buildings down, but they cannot knock down our resolve. I thought that was a very good point he made.
Many of these people in an LA area gym admitted they were frightened and came here only for something to do.
I'm looking at the streets and it looks like Beirut. And I can't believe it's my backyard.
The smoke continues to billow out of the Trade Center building 6 hours.
I think we're definitely going to go to war.
This Korean War vet sure hopes not, but he knows the feeling.
I see what it says right there. America under attack. People didn't have to die.
But they did die, and America's in mourning. Ann McDermott, CNN, Los Angeles.
They're a live picture now as the sun gets ready to break over the skies of New York. The skyline itself radically changed from yesterday. A gaping hole in that skyline as the twin towers of the World Trade Center no longer standing.
Yeah, the morning after this horrible tragedy, perhaps thousands dead, and you see the sky over Manhattan starting to lighten up now as sunrise is almost upon us in New York City.
And even as we speak, hundreds of firefighters and police officers and rescue workers are digging through the rubble of what is left of the World Trade Center, trying to find survivors. We may not know for days or even weeks how many people died in that tragedy, but an estimated 50,000 people work at the World Trade Center. Some 150,000 visit there every single day, people unaccounted for, including 300 firefighters who were part of the initial rescue operation.
And good morning from the CNN Center in Atlanta. I'm Vince Cellini.
And I'm Carol Lynn. I'm glad you're joining us here. We have the very latest now on this terrorist attack on America. It's hard to believe, but just about 21 hours ago, a hijacked American Airlines Boeing 767 crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The plane was hijacked shortly after taking off from Boston. And then minutes later, while Americans watched on televisions across the nation, a second hijacked airliner hit the Trade Center's other tower.
And not too long after these planes hit the World Trade Center, another hijacked airliner slamming into the Pentagon. This morning, emergency personnel hoping to begin searching the debris.
And then, Vince, in rural Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, this scene, yet another hijacked plane crashes. In all, 266 passengers and crew died in these plane hijackings, and authorities say the planes were taken over by small groups of men. In at least 2 cases, they used knives to commandeer the aircraft. A final account of the day of terror remains unwritten. The total number of those killed is not yet known. And now, live pictures of the streets of Manhattan there, just a glimpse of the devastation illuminated by some of the lights set up for the rescue operation. You saw in the lower right-hand corner there a helicopter scanning the scene. And you can't see, though, but hundreds of rescue workers there digging through, trying to save lives, if anyone has even survived.
Yeah, working tirelessly through the night. You can see now what awaits Manhattan this morning, the day after the horror. Garrett Gutley has been with us in New York and here again to talk about that as it is almost sunrise there in New York City. Garrett?
The light's certainly there, Vince, on the horizon just beyond New York Harbor there, the bay in lower Manhattan where the tragedy occurred. And this new day, this Wednesday in September, what kind of a day is it going to be? Well, if you look at the weather forecast in the upper right-hand corner, it's going to be another beautiful day as far as the weather is concerned, just like yesterday. Sunny, a few clouds in the sky, high of 77 degrees, but that's only the weather corner. Here is the front page once again. Let's go through the papers and just show you what has happened here. The New York Times, U.S. attack. You can't put it any more boldly than that. An 8-column headline right across the entire paper. The New York Daily News, the leading tabloid in circulation in this city, it's war, as direct as it can be. Same with the New York Post, an act of war. Sorry, get the hand out of there. With a picture still of the plane going into the tower, and the Wall Street Journal. And of course, this tragedy occurred right in the heart of the financial district of New York, the financial center of the world economy, if you will. Does terrorists destroy World Trade Center, hit Pentagon, and raid with hijacked jets? Everybody wondering what the implications are going to be of this, of course, politically, perhaps militarily one day. And yet the immediate concern, as we saw just a moment ago, is the continuing rescue effort down there in lower Manhattan. All night long, because this is indeed a 24-hour operation, the rescue efforts have been going on. Members of the fire department, disaster relief teams from the Red Cross and other organizations, the Salvation Army has been providing food down there. 10,000 meals being prepared for the rescue effort overnight and during the day that's coming. In addition to that, shelters have been set up around these rescue efforts for the hundreds and a few thousand people who live in the area who have lost all electric power in their homes and had to be taken into shelters. Indeed, some of their homes are in jeopardy due to structural damage from the terrorist attacks. Throughout the day, there will be the rescue teams here will be reinforced by more help. 3,000 members of the New York State National Guard will be moving into the city to take up positions to serve in any way that they possibly can to support and back up the fire department, the police, and the disaster teams there. And again, just look at it. Can you guess how long this is going to take to go through all of that? More than 100 stories twice over in the 2 towers crumpled down there. We know about the human loss of life. We don't know how many. We can only guess. The mayor says it'll be horrendous, in the thousands most likely. And the material damage, what's been lost there, not just buildings, but all the information, the knowledge, the computers crushed in there, memos, agendas, personal letters, correspondence, mementos, knickknacks. It's all buried there in one heap in lower Manhattan right now.
Garrick, earlier today you mentioned some of the names of the firefighters lost, over 300 of the New York firefighters missing or feared dead here. And only now, and throughout the night, periodically, we were putting faces and names to this horrible situation, and really that's kind of when it begins to sink in as well. Yes,
it's going to sink in with the names. In a way, it's been amazing. We haven't had more names yet coming out from these various disasters that have occurred. They will be coming out this day. And that's when we will begin to put the names and the faces together. How many people are there here, as there are in Washington or in Virginia, worrying about friends or loved ones in those targets that were hit? I know my wife, friends were calling friends today to find out if they were safe. I got a call back from one of my wife's friends. And she said, please tell her that she called me, she left a message in the machine, I'm all right. In fact, he said, I was fortunate. I was sick this morning. I didn't go to work in the World Trade Center. I'm at home. I've just been too shaken to call her back earlier. I think these are the kinds of calls and messages, hopefully, that'll be repeated many times as people are reassured that their friends. Yes, indeed.
And New York City, as we mentioned, is really a city with backbone. You know, people get back to it, take on challenges. Certainly none like we see here, but a city that I'm sure will brace itself, bow its neck, and just push forward.
It will push forward. And listen, Mayor Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, is a big booster and a cheerleader for New York. He talks about this being the capital of the world, and it is a unique metropolis. He talks about the can-do, tough spirit of New Yorkers. But let's face facts. The heroism here, the bravery here, which is an unlimited measure, is it any greater than that shown among those people in the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania or those in the Pentagon offices? We're talking not about New York City here, we're talking about the human spirit, and we're seeing it right here in these pictures downtown. We saw what happened yesterday and what will continue to happen in these early morning hours of this Wednesday. People pulling together, and there they are.
Garrick, of course, you've been at this as a journalist for a long, long time. And I wonder, even still, as you see some of the new video coming down, you see some of this and the wreckage, just how it hits home with you, and if you could possibly filter that through yourself for us and some of the viewers.
Yes, one thing does strike me. We talk about it's war, and people there in Lower Manhattan or at the Pentagon saying it's like a war scene. Veterans saying, I haven't seen anything like this since World War II or Korea. True, in terms of the tragedy. It's not that kind of a war. This is not World War II. Things were happening in Europe and in Iwo Jima, which were in many ways far worse than this in terms of loss of life and destruction. We grope to make these comparisons. And what happened today was really so unique. It was terrorism, which usually is seen as something being very brutal, yes, but very raw, unsophisticated, crude, if you will. And I think one of the things that shocks we Americans and those around the world watching this is that this was brutal, this was grotesque, and yet it wasn't crude. It was highly sophisticated. It took a great deal of planning. This is something new, and this is what shakes us.
Yes, it was calculated and diabolical. And Garrick Utley, we appreciate your presence there and your information this morning. Thank you. Carol?
Vince, we take you now live to Washington, D.C., where it's hard to believe, but that is the Pentagon still on fire more than 21 hours after an airplane plowed through to its inner ring. CNN's Bob Franken is on the scene. Bob, what can you tell us about what's happening?
It's not really a huge surprise to the officials who've been watching this. They're in meetings right now trying to decide when they can go into the building and start assessing the loss, particularly in human terms. But they've been waiting for the fire to go out, and as you can see, it has not. There have been embers, smoldering embers by just, you know, how many tons inside this building. And every once in a while, one of them erupts like you've been seeing right now. And you're seeing it, you can see it on the left side of your screen. It has flamed up again. It's quite a little distance away from where the plane actually crashed into the Pentagon yesterday. But before they can really go in there, they're going to have to be assured that there is no danger of fire erupting again. And of course, they're going to have to take a real good look-see with the light of day to see when they can start going through the rubble, when they can begin the grim task of finding out just how many casualties there are inside. There have been estimates into the several hundred, but Pentagon officials have adamantly refused to give any result. They just don't know at this particular point. Right now, it's still in the hands, as you can see, of the firefighters who are trying to put things out. It was about 9:40, I believe, yesterday morning when the plane crashed into the Pentagon. A plane that was flying from Dulles was on its way elsewhere, but then was diverted and came into that. We've been told that one passenger on the plane, someone I knew well and so many viewers of CNN knew well, Barbara Olson, was able to get hold of her husband, Ted Olson, the Solicitor General, and tell him that the terrorists had thrown the pilot out of the cockpit and had taken over the plane, and that it ultimately crashed into the Pentagon as it had crashed. Planes had crashed into the Twin Towers in New York that we've seen so much of in the fine reporting by Gary Cutley. But here we have a situation which still is not really ready, it looks, for the officials to go in and start assessing the damage. We are told that, nevertheless, the Defense Secretary intends to open this building up this morning for business as much as he can. Of course, a bit of symbolism there. They want to show the rest of the world that the military establishment in the United States can continue to operate. But the reality is that it's only going to be about half open. They've decided that about half of this building, 17 miles of corridors in the entire building, about half of them cannot be declared safe enough structurally for people to go in and work. But about half of it is going to be open. Sure, we're going to have briefings during the day. You can be sure that there will be planning going on in this building for retaliation once officials can decide where the retaliation is aimed.
All right, thank you very much,
Thanks, Bob
Franken.
Franken.
And now we want to bring you some live video here of Manhattan and where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. And you can see that dawn is breaking in New York City, and those New Yorkers, tough as they are, will come face to face with the devastation that was Tuesday. For some, we saw it on videotape here and around the world, but for the New Yorkers, it is all too real.
And Vince, take a look at this shot. This really gives you perspective and some context of the damage. In this next shot, I hope we can bring it up. It is, there it is, a wide shot of the damage and devastation. We are talking about 2 twin towers, more than 100 stories high. You know, potentially as many as 100,000 people could have been caught in that wreckage. You can still see the fire burning in the distance in the, you know, close to the upper left-hand corner there. This is being called the most devastating terrorist assault on U.S. soil in American history.
And people there hoping, as we are, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, miraculously, there's still some people that may have survived this.
That's right. Hundreds of people still unaccounted for, including some 300 firefighters who were there in the initial rescue operation when the first plane crashed into the North Tower. There you can see.
This is amazing, you know, the city skyline and how
smoke still rising.
How it's been altered. And it just really hits home. It's incredible.
So evident, a true symbol of financial power gone now from the horizon of New York City. And we wish those rescue workers well today. They've got a big job ahead of them and a very delicate operation, should there be survivors amidst tons
just
of
working,
rubble.
working tirelessly throughout late evening and the night. Now we want to go to Michael Oku at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, and he has an update for us there.
It's been eerily quiet here in Lower Manhattan, just in front of St. Vincent's Hospital, which, as you know by now, has become the major trauma and triage center here in New York. Just to my right, you can see that there are satellite trucks and police officers and personnel of all kinds on 14th Street, just north of here, a couple blocks north. Police have set up barricades, which you cannot see necessarily from this shot, but they have set up barricades, which essentially has limited traffic just south of 14th Street here in Lower Manhattan to a trickle of police vehicles, emergency medical vehicles, which sometimes punctuate the silent night air here, the silence here that has resonated throughout the evening. Moments ago, about an hour or so ago, we have seen now 4 victims who have been brought to this hospital. The last person we saw seemed to be a police officer, but it is not confirmed, and we do not know whether any of these victims sustained any injury that came as a result of the attack on the World Trade Center yesterday. I'm joined here by Tom Collier, who is with the University of Miami Medical Center. And Tom has been working as a volunteer, can tell us about some of the outpouring of emotional support that you've seen.
Well, the community in New York has been unbelievable, as always. The not only the national chains of food like Duane Reade and Starbucks and that kind of thing, but the local residents, people coming in and helping out any way they can, not only in products and foods, but also in time. All night long we've had every shift covered. We're getting food to the officers and to the nurses, to the doctors. We have set up 9 coffee stations throughout the hospital just so they don't leave the area and stay with the patients, which is where they really need to be.
Can you see whether it's actually making a difference?
It's making a difference, and it's, you know, our whole thought is if we just get 2 hands-free inside by doing what we're doing, then we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that's what we're trying to do.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The hospital officials here say that they will have a press briefing at 6:30, just a little while from now, and of course we will keep you posted on that. I'm Michael Oakley reporting live from Lower Manhattan.
Thank you, Michael. We want to go back to Garrick Utley, who's at the New York Bureau with a view of the skyline. Garrick, we've been hearing stories about things being reported on New York radio, something about people calling for help on their cell phones from the World Trade Center?
We've had those reports through the evening, indeed from city officials, that they have received some cell phone calls from those trapped in the rubble. Now, we're not quite clear whether it's in the rubble of the Twin Towers that came down or buildings around it where people are trapped because of debris, and also because a third building at number 7, the World Trade Center, also collapsed yesterday, late afternoon. So we're not sure where those calls are coming from, but yes, some messages have gotten through, and to the extent that the rescue effort can pinpoint where they are, they're certainly going to be going after them today.
Garrett, do you know whether they're saying how seriously they're hurt or how much danger they still feel they're in?
No, we've not heard anything since the news conference last night held by the mayor, Mayor Giuliani, and other city officials. They mentioned some of these phone calls. They're being very tight-lipped. Officials everywhere do not want to give out any information that can raise hopes too much or dash them too much. They're just waiting for events to unfold. I'm sure, though, that during the course of this day we'll be getting more information about that.
Sure. Garrick, do they think that these are credible calls?
Well, how do we know for certain? Certainly a prankster could do it. That would be the worst, the bleakest, the darkest, the dirtiest joke, if you will, if anybody tried to pull that stunt. But they believe they are credible. That's what they say. They're acting on that information. How many they are, we simply don't know. We do know, of course, earlier yesterday, even before those towers collapsed in rubble here, many people employed and working in their offices in the Twin Towers were calling friends and families, describing what was happened. And we were also told that by one of our colleagues at CNN that he had learned that one man called his wife and he knew that he was trapped right at the top and he wasn't going to get out.
Well, we will continue to hear these stories. Garrick, right behind you in your shot, we can see that it is just about daybreak there.
The sun is coming up to the east, and we want to take a look at at downtown here. As you see the lower part of Manhattan and that gaping, what can we call it, void, a hole where the Twin Towers used to be. There's still a lot of dust, some smoke, but that's a mixture of dust and smoke that's in the air there, and it's probably going to continue for some time because the rescue effort itself will keep kicking up the dust.
Speaking of that, and we have some pictures of the rescue effort that's continuing right now, that would be a difficult area to access even for regular traffic, would it not, let alone trying to do some of this massive recovery that's taking place now with the heavy machinery.
When we look, you're absolutely right. When we look at downtown or lower Manhattan, we see these modern, sleek skyscrapers. It's Wall Street, the financial district, but actually anybody who's visited realizes this is original New York City. This is where the first settlers landed. This is where George Washington was inaugurated as our first president, just a couple of blocks from those Twin Towers some 200 years ago. This is a part of town with not a grid system of streets, but tiny little streets and lanes along which they've built these giant buildings filled with hundreds and thousands of workers. So in the best of circumstances, it's a perpetual traffic jam down there. Now, of course, even with traffic and pedestrians cleared away and the people having fled, you've got to move in this giant equipment. And look at the cars that are down there. Look at the debris you've got. How do you maneuver in this space? Right there we're seeing a shot. That's along one of the broader avenues running north-south. But around the World Trade Center, That's just a catacomb, just a maze of tiny roads and streets.
Garrick, in taking a look at this shot, we get a sense also of the New York Police Department's rescue crews trying to move through that area. Are you hearing whether the rescue crews themselves are hearing the voices of people who are still alive, still trapped under there? And are they giving you a sense of how long it's going to take to get anybody out?
Well, several questions. First, no. No estimate yet as to how long it's going to take. It's going to be days and weeks. That is absolutely certain. Question number two, any survivors? Yes. The Port Authority, that's the regional government institution that runs the World Trade Centers, or ran them, runs the airports, the bridges. It reported that 3 or 4 of its security officials had been pulled out of the rubble. Presumably they're on the fringes. They heard voices. They were able to recover those men who were wounded or injured, but they're said to be, they're going to be all right. We heard an earlier report last night that the special teams that were brought in, special handlers with dogs trained to look and smell and sniff out humans, dead or alive, were going through the rubble, and very quickly the dogs indicated they had no scent. They couldn't get any scent. They were disoriented. Why? Because of all the dust in the air. The dust was interfering with the dogs, even with their sensitive sense of smell, to do their job. Perhaps today it'll get slightly better, we don't know, but that's another obstacle that stands in the way of the rescue effort.
All right, Garrick Utley, thank you for being our guide through this madness that is now Manhattan. We'll be checking in with you periodically. Carol?
The toughest hour still ahead, Vince. Right now, let's go to Kelly Wallace. She's standing by at the White House. Kelly, question on many Americans' minds. What sort of action is President Bush going to take, able to take? What are some of his options in responding to this crisis?
Well, definitely, as you heard President Bush say last night, Carol, he will say that the U.S. government is going to do everything it possibly can to find those responsible for these terrorist attacks. Mr. Bush also saying, though, that they will draw no distinction between those responsible for the attacks and those who harbor them. Now, as for a sight setter here at the White House, you might expect, and that is the case, flags at half-staff all around the White House complex for what is likely to be a very somber day here. President Bush, as you know, quite the early riser, usually up by 5:30 a.m. This day expected to be no different. He will begin his day getting an up-to-date briefing from his national security team on the latest concerning the investigation, as well as the search and rescue efforts. He's also invited a group, bipartisan congressional leaders, over to the White House, and at that time, Mr. Bush will come before the cameras again. His message will be that the U.S. government is doing everything it can to assist in the disaster areas in New York, Pennsylvania, and then, of course, at the Pentagon here in Washington, D.C. He will also say that the work of the government goes on, and again, that the U.S. will do everything possible to find those responsible. Last night, the president went before the American people, a very grim-faced U.S. President George W. Bush, in what must have been obviously a very difficult moment for the president. He said that those responsible for what he called acts of mass murder were hoping to frighten the nation into, his words, chaos and retreat. But Mr. Bush said they have failed.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining.
Now, U.S. officials publicly and privately right now refuse to say exactly who they believe might be responsible for these attacks, but we do know that senior administration officials briefed members of Congress last night. Sources telling my colleague CNN's John King that those senior officials saying they are confident that the evidence is pointing to affiliates of accused terrorist Osama bin Laden. Also, those senior officials saying that they are going to take their time to make sure they find out exactly who is responsible and then, of course, hold them accountable. Carol?
Kelly, you have seen both sides of the coin on this story. You're obviously in Washington now, but you were in New York yesterday. What was that like?
Absolutely. Images that none of us will really ever forget. I was actually about 15 blocks from the World Trade Center complex when the first plane hit one of the towers and then went out on the streets. I think the images that really come to mind are people sort of leaving the downtown area in a very orderly manner, but calling on their cell phones, look of disbelief as people watching not one but two towers come down. And also, I talked to so many firefighters. It was an unbelievable situation, Carol. You couldn't use cell phones, really. You could barely get a call out. And so as I was holding my cell phone trying to get calls out, firefighters would come up and say, "Can I use your phone?" We said we couldn't get a call out, but we would take their names and numbers and then call their relatives or their loved ones. Obviously, they were very concerned to let their loved ones know that they were okay, but clearly firefighters were concerned about their colleagues. So many people saying that they had gone in, those firefighters had gone into those towers as the people were coming out, and many people that we talked to very concerned about the firefighters who, of course, went into those buildings, and of course, what happened once those buildings came down.
That's
Carol.
right, still 300 firefighters unaccounted for. How did you get out of the area?
That was another difficult thing because, as you know, airports were closed, Amtrak was down for most of the day, bridges and tunnels going into Manhattan were down, but by late in the afternoon, around 4, 5, 6, Amtrak started running, at least around 5 o'clock, started running trains out of Washington, so there was some opportunity to get out. A lot of commuters who needed to get away. Obviously, there were ferries taking people from downtown Manhattan over to New Jersey. Again, it was sort of a very orderly thing. People were moving from the downtown area, getting away from the scenes of destruction, and obviously very patient. A lot of crowds at Amtrak at Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan, but I can tell you too, Carol, how this hit so many people on the train from New York to Washington. There was one woman who had a friend of a friend who was on one of those planes that obviously went down. A man in front of me had a friend of a friend who was in an office above where one of those planes hit. So you can see how many lives these tragedies have affected.
And Kelly, what a strange situation for you to be in. I mean, you're a trained journalist, you're taught to be dispassionate, you're told time and again that you're not to be a part of the story, and yet here you were in a situation where you were almost part of the rescue operation and trying to give technical support and trying to flee as well with the crowds.
Yeah, I mean, Carol, as you know, it is impossible not to be affected by the scenes of firefighters sort of sitting on a curb, their heads in their hands, wondering, you know, about their colleagues. So it's hard to be affected. What was great is that we could be of some assistance. I mean, how happy some of these firefighters were to know that we just talked to their wife, or my boyfriend's mother was able to get through, and that they knew that their loved ones could then call all the relatives so that at least they had some comfort. But of course, you know, there's so many people who just questioning whether or not their loved ones are still alive, and it's just impossible. You just do the best you can, try to help and get the story out. That was a major frustrating thing, Carol, though you couldn't get a cell phone to really work, so it was very difficult to call CNN New York or in Atlanta to convey what we were seeing, but that information was getting out throughout the day.
Right. Well, your instincts served you well, and I'm glad you're back safe home and now hard at work. Thank you very much. Kelly Wallace, reporting live from the White House. Vince?
We want to remind you we are just minutes away from a press conference that will be taking place at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. We'll get that as soon as they begin. But right now, with all due respect to the victims of this horrible tragedy, we want to see how the ramifications will affect now business in this country and worldwide. We go to David Haffenreffer, who's in New York, and he has that story. Good morning, David.
Good morning to you, Vince. As you might imagine, Lower Manhattan, the heart of the financial community. All financial markets obviously closed in the U.S. today. Even trading of U.S. stocks in London through the electronic trading firm Instinet have been halted. Let's take a look.
David, we have to interrupt you now, David. This is the press conference at St. Vincent's Hospital. We're taking that live.
FAL, Associate Director of the Trauma Center here at St. Vincent Catholic Medical Center. Let me first briefly update you on our numbers and what has happened during the night, and then Dr. Westphal can give you some information on our paramedics, our ambulances, what they've been doing, and what's been happening in the Trauma Center. Since 9:04 a.m. yesterday morning, St. Vincent Catholic Medical Center has received 361 individuals through our emergency room trauma center. 90 of those individuals have been admitted to St. Vincent's Manhattan. 4 of those individuals have died. 58 of the individuals who have come to St. Vincent are paramedics, firefighters, or police officers. We have 6 other hospitals in our system in Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. Those hospitals received 42 additional patients, including 20 who were brought by barge over to St. Vincent, Staten Island. One of those individuals died at St. Vincent, Staten Island. Our paramedics were at the scene throughout the day yesterday. As you saw and continue to see, we are ready for what we hope will be additional survivors today. We are the closest trauma center, and thus if there are any miraculous recoveries from the wreckage, they will most likely be brought here. I'm going to ask Dr. Westphal to talk to you a bit about our paramedics and the work that they did, our ambulances, and the work that's happened in the trauma center, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Westphal, Associate Director of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Mr. Ackerman has mentioned the number of patients that we've had, the conditions, and the 4 deaths in Manhattan here. Our paramedics have had about 7 crews since 8 a.m. yesterday morning that have assisted Fidney EMS in obviously this massive undertaking of responding to critical trauma emergencies downtown. All of our crews have been able to participate and treat patients and move patients, and fortunately have not been injured or been critically injured themselves. We have in the emergency department right now all through the night a triple staff of nurses, physicians, physician assistants, and technical staff. The administrative senior management has been up, almost all of them throughout the night, and we've been prepared and are awaiting victims from the site as well. We are, as I think Mayor Giuliani has said over and over, we are very hopeful, we are prepared, and we are expecting to work very hard to resuscitate victims as they're brought here and brought to other hospitals. I know that through the night I've been told by OEM and Fidney that other major hospitals in Manhattan have been similar to ourselves, and we've really decompressed the emergency department, so we're prepared for major injuries, major trauma, as we have had throughout the day.
I'd like to note a couple of important things. We want to first thank all New Yorkers and people from literally throughout the world who came to the hospital yesterday to volunteer their services. Doctors, nurses, just people off the street. We had over 800 people in line at one point in time to give blood. The mayor's office was kind enough to provide buses so we could bring them to other sites to donate that blood. Today, we are still in need of blood. All of New York is in need of blood donations. You should go to the New York Blood Center or the Red Cross, and we will provide those addresses to you. We can't stress enough that thanks to all of the volunteers, our neighborhood residents here in Greenwich Village. Behind my left, there are still tables set up where neighborhood residents are making sandwiches, bringing food. It's truly unbelievable, the outpouring of New Yorkers and the help that they have been. If anyone wants to give blood, we will provide that information to you. We've also received an inordinate amount of clothing through the night. We are very grateful for that, but we are really not in any need of any more of that right now. So we would just like to thank folks for that. It is very important to note that the trauma of this, from a psychological perspective, is going to be hitting New Yorkers more and more today. We particularly encourage parents to talk with their children. I went home for a few hours last night, and I have to tell you, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my teenage children and younger needed to talk. And it's very important that we encourage all parents to do that. In an effort to help with that, we have 3 mental health hotlines that are manned 24 hours a day. We will provide you with those numbers as well. There are many mental health crisis lines. We encourage all New Yorkers to take advantage of this. We have all suffered a terrible trauma in this city. We need to understand it and our feelings and to talk about it. So we encourage New Yorkers to take advantage of these. We have facilities in Westchester, Manhattan, and Staten Island that are manned 24 hours a day for this. We could take questions. There were no additional survivors brought here during the night. We did receive a number of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, again, mostly with the corneal abrasions and literally lacerations on their hands. I don't know exactly what time it was, but during the night, we did receive the firefighters and paramedics. Yeah, I'll let Dr. Westfall speak to that.
Yes. Well, I don't know about amputation, but to provide additional medical care, we had about 2 crews of about a dozen doctors that went down to there to assist with treating patients. We also had a group, I believe, of about 4 physicians that went up to the Javits Center very late in the night to treat additional patients that were brought there, as they had requested help. I cannot speak for that. I'm not aware.
Sir, how would you characterize your efforts to try to get people from Ground Zero? Are you frustrated by the sort of the debris you see there at this point? Are you able to get them out of there with the kinds of swiftness?
Speaking for our paramedics that had been there all during the day, along with Fidney's paramedics and all other hospitals' paramedics, and if I could just echo what Mr. Ackerman said, I can't believe the number of hundreds of vehicles and ambulances that have responded from.
One of the administrators of St. Vincent's Hospital, which is one of the area hospitals where a large number of the victims were taken, describing the level of support the hospital is getting from volunteers in the area. I think that level of support has been repeated elsewhere in the city. I was on the phone yesterday with a couple hospitals confirming the fact that they couldn't even handle the number of people who would come to the hospital to donate blood. There is still a dire need of blood.
Don't feel.
Yeah.
I told her, you know, he's crouton. 2 periods of rain tomorrow and cloudy. Flights?
No, not really. A few people this morning in there, but the terminals are really, really quiet. I think the message has gotten out to people to not come. No point in coming here because the flights aren't going. Right. So the best thing is to stay home. Even if the airspace restriction is lifted, if that happens sometime today, people should check with their airlines before they do anything because we don't coordinate the flights. Airlines obviously do that on their own, and they'll have to work through their own schedule when they're going to put their.
And we're looking.
Canada.
And we have.
Joint international action against terrorism and felt that nobody was really listening this morning.
Who is to blame for this apparent lapse of security? Look at this rubble as we had all morning long. It seems an absolute miracle that anybody could survive the crush of 2 107-story towers unfolding on them.
Truly, the word miraculous is probably a bit overused. Normally it applies in this case. Let's move on just a little bit. The name Osama bin Laden has been used all this morning as we talk about the short list of potential suspects for this dramatic, well-choreographed attack. The short list, really, he and his organization involving thousands at the top of it. And they are harbored, it is widely known, in Afghanistan by the Taliban. We are joined now live via video phone from Kabul, Afghanistan, by CNN's Nick Robertson. Nick?
Well, Miles, certainly a lot of attention focused on Afghanistan at this time because of Osama bin Laden. We have been told by diplomats here that senior Pakistani officials are at this moment meeting with senior Taliban government officials. Now, Pakistan is one of the only 3 countries to have recognized Taliban as the rightful rulers of Afghanistan, and Pakistan is regarded by many countries as perhaps one of those countries that has the greatest influence over the Taliban. We don't know the content of those meetings at this time. However, we can confirm that meetings between senior Pakistani and senior Taliban officials are going on at this time. It has been, however, in Kabul today and elsewhere in Afghanistan, a day of apprehension for many.
Fearing what might come next after the attacks on the United States, international aid groups began pulling out of Kabul by early morning. The German charity group Agro Action, one of the first to leave. United Nations operations here also virtually closing down as key staff leave, a procedure followed in the past for safety when regional tensions are high. Apprehension also in Afghanistan's Taliban leadership. Foreign Minister Wakil Ahmed Mutawakil quick to explain their position after the attacks in America.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has always expressed its condemnation of terrorism. Afghanistan has also been targeted with terrorism, and we have been victims of terrorism. We condemn it here and internationally. Terrorism is frightening and creates hatred.
With suspicion of responsibility falling on Osama bin Laden, Mutawakil's government, well aware the implications bin Laden's involvement would have for the Taliban, was keen to say bin Laden was not responsible.
So far, no one has officially accused us. If anyone has brought up his name, it is because his reputation of the past.
Overnight, the already tense atmosphere raised by an air raid on Kabul, illuminating the sky with rocket and anti-aircraft fire. An ammunition dump hit and 2 planes at Kabul airport destroyed in an attack by the Taliban foe, the Northern Alliance.
Well, for most people here, it really is life as normal. The departure of the aid workers will fuel fears about the future, but many Afghans here are impoverished after 20 years of war, and they have few other options really than to sit tight and just wait and see what happens, Miles.
CNN's Nick Robertson, exclusively live from Kabul, Afghanistan. Let's talk now about give you a quick recap. There were 4 airliners in all involved in this coordinated attack. 2 of them, of course, we've been telling you about just recently, plowed into the World Trade Center. A third, American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, was to fly from Dulles Airport to Los Angeles. Instead, struck the Pentagon. CNN's Bob Franken is in front of the Pentagon now with the latest from there. Bob.
And we have some further information on the search effort to try and find out just how many casualties there are, and of course also to see if it's entirely at all possible that there might be some survivors in the rubble of the crash, the plane that was hijackers crashed into the Pentagon. You can see that, of course, in back of me. What we have been told by Mike Tamilo, who is a battalion chief with the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Unit. That's the worldwide unit that has gone into so many disasters around the world and has searched for both the victims and the survivors of tragedies. He says that as early as yesterday during the day that the unit was able to take some of its search dogs and go through very gingerly some of the area. He said that they, quote, identified some bodies, close quote, by which he means that they did find some people who had been killed. He did not have a number. He did not say, however, they had been removed. We have been told that a temporary mortuary has been set up not far from here. We do not have any information from the Pentagon on any casualty numbers or even an estimate of them. There was one local fire chief who said it could be anywhere between 100 and 800 deaths as a result of this. Pentagon officials think that the upper figure is way too high. Now, he also said, he being the Fairfax County search and rescue person, that the search is resuming today. It stops overnight because it is so dark and so smoky inside that there is a concern that people are going to trip over the debris as they conduct their search. But the search is beginning inside now as they try and find out exactly the human tragedy of this catastrophe that has befallen the Pentagon. At the very same time, in other parts of the building, the Pentagon is open for business. It was important to the Defense Secretary, he said, to show that in spite of all this, that the operations here would continue. About half the building is considered safe enough to use, 17 miles of corridor, so about half of those are going to be in the safe area. That includes many of the vital operations that are conducted by the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the grim search goes on for the casualties of this disaster. Miles?
There are 20,000 workers who report to the Pentagon each day. I assume that not all of them have been asked to report to those areas that are considered safe. Is it just essential personnel?
Well, the word was spread through Washington media in the hours yesterday and overnight that people should call supervisors to find out if, in fact, they are among those who should go in. But, of course, many of them know what part of the Pentagon where they work, and, of course, some of the answers would make good sense. But the Pentagon is open for business. They're making a very important point with that, they believe, and it opened about 45 minutes ago.
CNN's Bob Franken at the Pentagon. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to London, where the markets there are taking a moment now to remember those victims of these attacks. A moment of silence. Let's listen. London markets ceasing business for a period of time to remember those killed and injured in those dramatic attacks. Paula?
Thanks so much, Miles. I think that'll be a scene repeated all over the world today. I know churches are talking about having moments of silence throughout the country, and no doubt Americans today will continue to feel the sting of this horrible tragedy that has confronted our country. Right now, I am joined by Dennis Ross, who is the former special envoy in the Middle East. He served in the Clinton administration. Welcome, sir. Good to have you with us this morning. I wanted you to provide some context for us today. Yesterday, we saw some groups of Palestinians celebrating in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and declaring this as a victory against Israel. How widely held of a view is that among Palestinians?
I think today it's probably wider than many Palestinian officials would suggest that it is. I mean, you are dealing in a climate where there's a lot of anger among the Palestinians and a desire to hit back. But there's also a climate that has been created by their leadership. You cannot continually talk about the virtues of martyrdom. You cannot continually talk about the importance of struggle. And you cannot continually extol the virtues of the suicide bombers and talk about how the United States must also pay without there being a consequence in terms of attitudes. One of the things that is going to have to be done, not only with the Palestinians, but with many of the Arab regimes that are friendly to the United States, they cannot continue to use their media as a release for outrage and for anger, and therefore allow within those medias, which basically are not free except to spew certain hatred, they cannot use those medias to create a climate of legitimacy for this kind of behavior, and that is what they have done.
How are you going to stop that from happening?
Well, one of the ways is if in fact these governments, especially in the Middle East, among our Arab friends, want us to be engaged in terms of pursuing diplomacy at an appropriate moment, there's also going to have to be an understanding that there's no free lunch here. They have responsibilities too. And one of the ways that they can carry out their responsibilities is to make it clear this behavior does not represent their cause, it discredits their cause, and in fact, if they want the world to identify with their interests, they're going to have to behave differently.
All right, but the bottom line is a lot of people think that U.S. policy in the Middle East makes the United States much more vulnerable to attack. Is that true?
Well, there's no question right now that there is anger that is obviously directed against us because of the frustration of what's going on in the conflict. But again, I'll tell you, if we had been able, as we were trying to do last year, to end the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians last year, the people who carried out this attack would have done it anyway. They don't believe in peace. They don't believe in Israel's existence. They reject everything that we represent. So one of the things that has to happen is these groups have to be completely discredited.
And do you have any level of optimism that will ever happen?
Well, I think we all have to transform our own thinking. Yesterday was a transforming event. We're going to have to create a new priority in terms of the war on terror. We're going to have to create a very different kind of coalition internationally that focuses on how, in fact, we all work together to discredit this, practically and psychologically. And I think also whatever it is we're going to do militarily has to take a long view about rooting out the real networks that exist. But I don't think one can simply sit back and say because the task is difficult, we can't take it on. We've now been confronted with something that is so dramatic, that is worse than any war we've confronted in terms of casualties in a single day. Our own thinking is going to have to change as well.
I know that Henry Kissinger stated yesterday that this is the time the United States is going to find out the true level of friendships with other nations. How critical is any role that Russia might play in this?
Well, I do believe the Russians have some capability when it comes to fighting terror, and also there is a history of some relations they have with some of the groups in the area. In the past, it would have been more profound because, in fact, they tended to support those groups. Now I think it's less profound. But in terms of creating a psychological atmosphere internationally, the more the Russians, the more the Europeans are seen as joining with us in terms of making it clear This behavior is not simply unacceptable, but it won't be tolerated. And those states that give a kind of safe haven are also not going to be tolerated. The more that happens, the more we'll be moving in the right direction.
Dennis, if you would be generous enough to stand by, I want to continue my conversation with you, but I want to remind our audience, it was just about 24 hours ago, and we're going to replay some pictures here of the first hijacked commercial airliner that struck the North Tower here in New York City. Actually, this is the picture of the South Tower, which was the second attack that came 18 minutes later. Once again, this city just starting to come to grips with the impact of this double attack here yesterday. Dennis, Secretary of State Colin Powell was a guest on the air earlier this morning and bristled when I asked him about Senator Orrin Hatch's assessment that U.S. intelligence has now intercepted communications between bin Laden supporters actually discussing the attacks. Bristles may be too strong of a word, but I think he made it quite clear he is extremely uncomfortable that Senator Orrin Hatch is talking about any of this intelligence information. You understand that, I guess?
Yes, I do. Well, look, I think there are two dimensions to that. The first is we obviously have certain kinds of techniques and methods which we don't want compromised, because if they get compromised, then you lose the capacity to use those. And obviously, right now, what we're trying to do in the intelligence area is figure out exactly what happened, look back at what might have been indicators that were discounted because they weren't seen as plausible, and then pursue those leads. So anything that compromises the ability to find out what happened is obviously something that's not going to be in our interest, number one.
All right, but Dennis, do you have reason to believe these communications were actually intercepted, showing? I mean, we know that an Arab newspaper based in London, I think at least the editor had reported that these attacks were telegraphed as long as 3 weeks ago. Do you believe the intelligence information?
Look, my sense at this point is we don't really know. And the tendency is to leap to a conclusion because we all want to know in response to such a horrific set of events. I would just tell you from a historic standpoint, we were convinced early on that with Pan Am 103 it was groups based in Syria. Later on we found out that it wasn't. It may well be that the speculation about Osama bin Laden turns out to be right, but I think we really do have to be cautious at this point. The people who carried this out not only had great organization, they had people who could fly these planes. That's not something that is normally associated with the Osama bin Laden group. So I think one has to be somewhat cautious, and I think that Secretary Powell's reaction was entirely appropriate.
All right, Dennis Ross, thank you very much for all your insights this morning. We very much appreciate your joining us. Right now, we're going to turn our attention to London, and that's where we find Christiane Amanpour this morning. You're what, outside 10 Downing Street right now?
Yes, indeed, Paula. We're outside 10 Downing Street, the official residence and office of the British Prime Minister. Britain, the United States' closest ally in Europe. In the last couple of hours, the Prime Minister has done several things. He's had a 20-minute telephone conversation with President George W. Bush. He has had a press conference in which he was very forthright and very convincing towards the press about how he viewed what had happened in the United States yesterday. He's convened security meetings and he is convening a cabinet meeting. He's calling back Parliament to discuss this issue and raise a public debate as to what has happened and what measures can be taken to combat this kind of terrorism. He said that this is not just an attack on the United States, but one on the entire free world. He said that he and other presidents and prime ministers in Europe are in constant touch about how to, quote, stop this machinery of terror, how to eradicate and defeat what he called these terrorists. And this, it must be pointed out, was not just the single biggest act of terrorism against the United States, but in recorded memory, the single biggest act of terrorism anywhere in the world that anybody can remember. And to that effect, the Prime Minister said, and other analysts have said, to that effect, essentially everyone today is an American.
I want to make one thing very clear indeed. This was not an attack on America alone. This was an attack on the free and democratic world everywhere. And this is a responsibility that the free and democratic world have got to shoulder together with America. And at this time of tragedy in the United States of America that has consequences right across the world. And as I say, there will be British people that have lost their lives. This time of tragedy and this time of grief and anger and trial in America, it is important that Americans know that their allies and their friends around the world do stand shoulder to shoulder with them.
Now, the Prime Minister mentioned that he expected that there could be a great number of British casualties, since there are a lot of British people in the United States living there as residents and working there. He said to that effect, Britain's interests are effectively engaged in what he called this combat against terrorism. He called this an act of terrorism on a scale that was, quote, never before contemplated. While he would not be specific about what possible retaliation or action that could be taken against whoever becomes identified as responsible, he did insist that the leaders of Europe, in consultation with the United States, would take whatever measures necessary to make sure that this kind of terrorism was eradicated. Again, no specifics, but the Prime Minister very forceful. And then he would not be drawn on who he thought was actually responsible, but he did single out, without being prompted, the Muslim community in Britain, singling him out, saying that he was very gratified that they had come out and denounced this act of terrorism, like he said did the Muslim community of the United States. Again, when we specifically asked him, do you believe that this was Islamic terrorism, he did not answer. Again and again, he called this an attack on the civilized world, an attack not just on the United States, but on humanity and on democracy. When we asked him, do you believe that this is a declaration of war, and therefore are you, the civilized world, obligated to take action to combat this? Again, he wouldn't be drawn, other than to say that they were in close consultation and that this act of terrorism and the machinery of terrorism and the finance and the support has to be stopped. Paula?
The Prime Minister, in that short soundbite, forcefully talked about the collective need to fight this kind of terrorism. What kind of level of support can President Bush expect in Europe?
Well, certainly from Great Britain, I would say a great deal of support. Remember, the British have stood shoulder to shoulder, as the Prime Minister said, with the United States in various actions in the last 10 years alone, much less in history. They have been shoulder to shoulder during the Gulf War, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. This Prime Minister, Tony Blair, took a leading role in the action against Kosovo. This country has said over and over again that it stands together with its chief ally, the United States. And at the moment, what we're hearing from every capital of Europe is that they are together with the United States, because this is an attack against, quote, all of us. We are all targets, they said. And Germany, for instance, offered unlimited support. This is in the words of German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and he stressed the word unlimited. All the capitals of Europe are holding emergency security convening meetings, cabinet meetings, security meetings. All are in touch with each other. There's a special meeting of the European Union. NATO's chiefs have been meeting as well. And this has really, as you can imagine, focused people's minds here. And it remains to be seen what exactly they do. Will they try to line up support in like-minded countries and in the Middle East, for instance, amongst allies and elsewhere around the world, to make people, as they say, stand up on the side of civilization against what they call these barbaric acts of terrorism?
Christiane, earlier today I had a chance to peek at some of the headlines in the London newspapers on a very human level. What is the reaction of average British citizens to what the kind of wrath that we...
Well, on a very human level, I can tell you the reaction is one of shock, profound shock, and indeed fear. I've heard people talking about how this is just scary. People cannot imagine that something of this magnitude, of this organization, in a place like New York and Washington and other cities in the United States, that this could happen. And people really feel that if this can happen in the United States, well, then it can happen anywhere. United States is meant to be Fortress America. This is not meant to happen in the United States of America, and it has profoundly shocked people. I talked to people, I was flying yesterday after this had happened. I talked to pilots and air crews and passengers on the planes. All of them absolutely absolutely stunned beyond words. There are no words that can really sum up exactly what has happened and what people are feeling. Here in England, talking to taxi drivers, people on the streets, people are using the analogy to Pearl Harbor. People are using words like barbaric. This is profoundly shocking. Every single newspaper here, even the normally sedate broadsheets here, have got blaring headlines: assault on America, doomsday America, one, the Times of London, war on America, you know, a tabloid. Is this the end of the world? I mean, this is...
All right, we apparently have lost our satellite to London, where Christiane Amanpour was just giving us the British reaction to the catastrophe that the United States witnessed yesterday. We will hope to bring her back a little bit later this morning. She also gave us some insights as to how the Prime Minister is dealing with this. He just very recently had a long conversation, 20-minute conversation with President Bush, as there is continued talk about what kind of collective effort needs to be made to fight this brand of terrorism. Let's catch up with Kira Phillips right now, that has some more thoughts on how the nation will continue to react to what happened in Pennsylvania yesterday, what happened at the Pentagon, and the twin attacks here in New York City. Kira?
Paula, thank you. Reaction is definitely the key word here. We're going to take you actually live to Logan Airport, and that is where two of the hijacked planes came from. We're going to turn it over to our Bill Delaney, who's live at the command center there. Bill, can you tell us what's happening right now within the center?
Thank you, Kira. Hundreds of federal, state, and local police, led by the FBI, now fanning out here in the Boston area to try to determine how these hijackers could have gotten on the two planes that left Boston yesterday morning and ended up crashing into the World Trade Center. The question: was there some kind of a terrorist cell here in Boston that enabled these hijackers to lay the groundwork for what they did? Now, a security expert I spoke to here this morning, Kira, said in many ways Boston is an ideal place for that sort of thing. It is a small city, but a major city, and importantly, it's near an international border, Canada. Now, we know before the millennium, an Algerian was arrested on the Vermont border. This Algerian found to have ties to another Algerian who tried at that time to cross into Washington State for a terrorist action at the time of the millennium in Seattle. So we've seen that sort of thing here before. Also, we don't know if Arabs were involved in this, but if they were, there is a sizable Arab community here in Boston. It's a place one could obtain some anonymity, the security source said to me. Now, there are reports here, Kira, this morning of several suspects being looked at who may have been involved in this hijacking. The Boston Herald newspaper reporting 2 brothers may have been involved, both carrying United Arab Emirates passports, one of them a trained pilot. Also, importantly, Kira, a rented car taken from the central parking garage here at Logan Airport yesterday. Now, this rented car reportedly contained Arab language training manuals for flying a commercial aircraft. Now, the authorities focused on this car because a passenger who left here on a flight from Boston yesterday, when he arrived at his destination and found out about the terrorist actions, realized that he had had an altercation with several Arab men in the central parking garage. He called authorities, and they are looking at this vehicle. I should also mention that earlier this year, the FBI did determine that in the late 90s there were Arab men here, 2 with ties to the Osama bin Laden organization. They left suddenly in the late 90s, but one of them, a man named Bassam Kanj, had lived here for some 15 years working as a cab driver. He was subsequently killed in Lebanon in an attack on the Lebanese army, financed, security sources believe, by Osama bin Laden. The other Arab, Rail Hijazi, also was a cab driver here in Boston. He is in jail in Jordan for an involvement in a plan to blow up a hotel in Jordan that contained mostly American and Israeli tourists at the time of the millennium. So there have been traces of people tied to Osama bin Laden, if indeed Osama bin Laden was involved in this in the past here in Boston. And as I say, hundreds of federal, state, and local investigators now trying to sort out how hijackers got on those 2 planes here at Logan Airport yesterday.
Our Bill Delaney, thank you very much. Those are definitely riveting details. We'll continue to follow up with you at Logan Airport. Miles, we're going to take it back over to you at the desk.
All right, thank you very much, Kira. Live pictures from the Pentagon right now. Let's take a look at the scene that is unfolding as the effort there continues. Not a lot of hope this morning. Matter of fact, no hope of finding any survivors inside the wreckage there of the Army side of the Pentagon. 5-sided building, obviously, 5 stories. Some portions of it are opened, and some portion of the 20,000 workers who typically report there every day are at work there on what is, of course, not a normal day, but the routine will try to continue. There was immediately before we took this live image, there was a convoy of vehicles. There you see them. This is a tape image, which came down just a few moments ago. Convoy of vehicles there. We can presume they are part of the effort to continue the salvage efforts there at the Pentagon. We'll keep you posted as events unfold there. Back now to a live picture. Let's do a quick recap. It has now been 24 hours since the nightmare began and everything really changed. Today, we are revealing more evidence of just how horrific it all was. In New York this morning, a frantic search and rescue effort continues. Crews have found some survivors amid the rubble of what was the World Trade Center. We underscore that point. Leveled the World Trade Center. Authorities tell CNN at least 9 people have been found alive this morning, but the death toll from the terrorist attacks is expected to be staggering. All we know now is it will be in the thousands. The horror began to unfold 24 hours ago as a plane tore through the first of the World Trade Center towers. This picture came in overnight. It's a different angle on it. Ripped into the building, created a huge fireball. That was American Airlines Flight 11, a 767 with 81 passengers, 11 crew members. It was supposed to fly from Boston to Los Angeles, somewhere over the Adirondack Mountains. It took a sharp detour to the south. Now, 18 minutes later, a second jet slammed in to the other tower of the World Trade Center, both of them 110 stories high. This is United Flight 175. Also point of origin was Boston, also intended destination of Los Angeles. Both of those aircraft heavily laden with fuel for the transcontinental flight. 56 passengers, 9 crew members on board that plane. We have had reports from cellular telephone conversations that were managed to be delivered from these planes that there were knife-wielding suspects who commandeered these aircraft and were at the controls of the aircraft at the time. Now, both World Trade Center towers, of course, eventually collapsed. Here, as we see right here, the second tower imploding. That was at about 10 o'clock Eastern time yesterday. Those the gleaming symbols of New York for more than 20 years now, symbol of our wealth, symbol of U.S. prosperity. All of it now reduced to rubble today, and there are 5 sub-floors there. And earlier in our reporting, Gary Tuckman was indicating there is some hope that there may be additional survivors deep beneath that rubble. An amazing Herculean effort underway right now to try to find people who might be alive in that pile of rubble, many thousands of tons. At the Pentagon this morning, firefighters poured more water on the smoldering building damaged by the suicide plane attack. That was American Airlines Flight 77, 757, Dulles to Los Angeles, its intended destination. 58 passengers, 6 crew members, 800 people killed in that particular attack. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says the Pentagon is in fact open for business today. We should say portions of the Pentagon, those deemed fit and those deemed safe for occupants. But the concern about that structural integrity will keep everybody out but the essential personnel, at least for today. Still no word on exactly how many people were injured total in that attack. We are getting ballpark estimates of, as we said, 800 people killed in that attack. The attack at the heart of the U.S. financial center is reverberating throughout world markets today. In Japan, the Nikkei average plunged below 10,000 for the first time in 17 years. European stock market averages are undergoing sharp price swings today. Most opened lower and showed some gains before moving lower again. U.S. financial markets will remain closed today. The World Trade Center is, of course, at the heart of the financial district for this country. Across the U.S., there are some cases of soaring gas prices, which we could probably infer to be a bit of profiteering. In some places, the price jumped to nearly $5 a gallon. The nation's largest oil companies are trying to ease fears by pledging to keep distribution steady. That brings you up to date this morning on a morning that will be a morning that we are forever changed. Send it back to Paula Zahn in New York. Paula?
Miles, I want to try to give you an idea of what life is actually like in New York City today, drastically different from an average weekday. As you look at the streets, there is a fraction of the traffic you'd normally see. You'd usually see bumper-to-bumper traffic at that corner at this time of the morning. The reason for this is that all public schools are closed, private schools, parochial schools. The Dow Jones is closed, the NASDAQ.
No signs of life, and now the primary mission appears to be to recover the dead. Rescue workers using cadaver dogs worked through the night on the grisly task of searching for the dead. Local fire officials estimate as many as 800 were killed, many still buried in the debris. The Pentagon, the center of America's military power, devastated by a sneak terrorist attack. American Airlines Flight 77 hijacked shortly after takeoff from Dulles Airport, with terrorists at the controls traveling at 600 miles per hour with 6,000 gallons of fuel. The jet slams into the 2 lower floors of the Pentagon.
It kind of disappeared over this embankment here for a moment, and then huge explosion, flames flying into the air, and just chaos on the road.
I hate to say it, but I did fall apart when it first happened. I was very frightened. This doesn't happen in America. I guess it does.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was at work at his desk.
I felt the shock of the airplane hitting the building, went through the building and then out into the area, and they were bringing bodies out that had been injured.
The plane slices deep into the Pentagon, cutting through offices primarily occupied by the Navy and Marines. The upper floors later collapse. The question now, how will the U.S. military respond? Worldwide, American military forces are put at the highest state of alert, ThreatCon Delta. And even as part of the Pentagon burned, military planners continue to review the options. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Hugh Shelton, with a pledge to retaliate against those responsible.
I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
The Pentagon has long had a number of contingency plans to attack a variety of Osama bin Laden targets. Those plans are now under serious review. The aircraft carrier Enterprise, headed home from the Persian Gulf, ordered to remain in the area in case President Bush orders military strikes. Now, before rescue workers can actually enter the most devastated part of this area, engineers are actually going to have to knock down the unstable portions of the building to make it safe for those rescue workers. And local firefighting officials say it could be as long as a week before we know exactly how many people died here. Matt?
But again, Mick, the latest figures you're hearing, it could be up to 800 people.
800 people, civilians and military alike, remain unaccounted for this morning.
Jim Miklashevsky at the Pentagon. Mick, thanks very much. Here's Katie.
Matt, that number is staggering. Meanwhile, all 4 of Tuesday's hijacked flights were headed to California. NBC's George Lewis is at LAX, where 3 of those 4 planes were headed. George, good morning.
Good morning, Katie. LAX remains closed at this hour. The relatives of those aboard the hijacked planes have been taken to 2 nearby hotels by the 2 airlines involved, American and United. They're meeting with grief counselors there. No word yet on when the airport may reopen. But as you said, because all the flights were bound to California, the events back east have had an enormous impact here.
Shocked and grieving, the relatives of the airline passengers were quickly escorted to a private area at LA International and later to 2 nearby hotels. Among the passengers bound for Los Angeles, David Angel, the producer of the TV series Frasier, and lawyer and TV commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. Before her plane crashed into the Pentagon, Olson reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him the jetliner was being hijacked by men with knives, that the crew and all the passengers were being forced to the back of the aircraft. On United Airlines 93, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, Tom Burnett, vice president of a medical devices company in Northern California, called his wife and indicated he and other passengers were trying to overcome the hijackers. Father Frank Colachico, a friend of the family.
Yeah, he called her on the cell phone and told her that one of the passengers was already dead and that they knew that they were all going to die, and that 2 other men and he were going to try to do something, the conversation, and love you, honey. And that was the end of the conversation.
On the same plane, Mark Bingham called his mother and his aunt.
He just said, I want to let y'all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I hope it was quick. I hope he took an active part in thwarting the hijackers.
Last night in Los Angeles, friends of 2 other hijacking victims attended a special church service, turning to their faith to ease the pain of the loss.
Now, here at LAX, there are 178 planes on the ground behind me, all stranded when the airport was shut down, as well as the rest of the air travel system in this country. And, pardon me, even if the air traffic system gets back up to speed today, it's going to be a long time sorting out all of those planes, many of them rumble. It's going to take a while to untangle.
All right, George Lewis in Los Angeles. George, thank you very much. Apparently, that is not the case at Chicago O'Hare's airport. Kelly O'Donnell joins us with the latest. Kelly, we had understood that all planes would be grounded until at least noon today. That according to the FAA yesterday. But I understand a plane has taken off from O'Hare?
Much to our surprise, when we heard a jet taking off here, we're right in the flight pattern outside O'Hare, and because of the grounding across the country, of course, we didn't miss it. And we looked at it. It's a United Airlines aircraft. We believe it's a 757. In talking to United officials here, they are headquartered in Chicago. They tell us that 2 of their aircraft have taken off in order to reposition. As you and George Lewis have been discussing, because planes were grounded yesterday, landing at airports not their cities of origin or destination, the fleet for all airlines is out of position. So United, giving its first indication that air travel may begin to resume today, is moving some of its aircraft. We've asked officials to tell us how many. They will say at this point at least 2. They wouldn't tell us if crews are on board, but presumably they may be moving flight attendants and other pilots and so forth to get to other airports so that they can begin to assess how to go about picking up the schedule. So here at O'Hare, there has been some movement. Again, 2 aircraft have taken off, both of them belonging to United.
And Kelly, presumably they had to get some kind of special permission from the FAA in order to do this.
I would assume so, and because the air traffic has been quiet except for military aircraft since the FAA ordered it yesterday, I would presume that there's some coordination going on. We've been making calls trying to find out about that, and officials are just reluctant to tell us at this point, or perhaps simply too busy trying to get it organized. But the first signs that travel may resume are at least beginning here at O'Hare.
All right, Kelly O'Donnell in Chicago at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Kelly, thank you very much. It is 18 past the hour. Now here's Matt.
Katie, thanks.
Ambulance just hightailed it out of there. My prayers are to the fellow firefighters, EMS, police officers that have died, and hopefully we'll be able to get some more some more out of there. We weren't able to get to the scene simply because it was very unsafe. So please, if you can, everybody, please pray for those that have fallen today.
Now, major burn cases have been some of the most serious injuries here, and doctors say those were people who were able to make it out on their own yesterday. And if you take a look at the rubble, you can see the delicate situation that the rescue workers have to go through in order to extricate anybody who might be alive. They are cheered any time that they do receive some sort of communication. Some of it has been by cell phone, but those cases are few and far between. What one of the hospital officials here was telling me earlier is that the paramedics say that they stop about every 45 minutes and they check in for sounds. They use special dogs to see if they can hear anything, if they can smell anything. Yeah, let you take a look. There's an ambulance pulling up behind me and shouts that there may be one of the firefighters inside. I can't confirm that for you at this point. but people moving into action here as they wait for any survivors to be brought in. Triple the staff than usual in the emergency room, ready to handle any of the victims. And doctors here are saying that the sort of casualties they're likely to see here today are going to be far worse than anything that they have seen yesterday. As I mentioned earlier, that first phone call came in at about 7:45 with word that some of these rescued personnel might be on their way in here. Doctors were then saying that they hadn't seen anything at that point. They may have been transferred over to other centers to handle burns, maybe up to the trauma unit at Cornell or over to Bellevue perhaps. So that is the story here. Very, very sobering to these people who are waiting to treat the victims, and very telling that many more victims have not been brought in. Paula?
Hillary Lane, thanks so much for that update. As I hear you heard your report, I guess I'm reminded that none of us are supposed to inject our own personal feelings in covering these stories, but you can't help but have a great deal of respect for the way volunteers are dealing with the carnage that has been wrought in this city. We had told you earlier this morning we expected Mayor Giuliani to hold a news conference. It has been delayed. We were expecting that about 45 minutes ago. We were told now it will get started shortly, and we'll go to that live. But once again, the level of support shown for the victims here is extraordinary. The scene you just saw playing out at St. Vincent's Hospital is being repeated all over the city, with doctors from neighboring hospitals trying to get in the city. In fact, it's difficult to get into the city today because there are a number of inbound bridges that are still closed. They're trying to get here to volunteer their services. People are trying to donate blood. There are reports even this morning of lines continuing to wrap around blocks of people trying to help out. In one of the more disturbing stories that's being reported, a barge last night actually carried some of the dead from New York into New Jersey. There are reports of cab companies literally ripping seats of their vans to actually carry the dead to New Jersey as well. We've heard a number of paramedics reinforce the fact that makeshift morgues are being set up all over the city. But the bottom line is, and I am sure that the mayor will probably reiterate this morning, no one, Miles, has any idea of the magnitude of loss in this city. There is hope downtown this morning, as you just heard Gary report, that 9 firefighters and police officers have been rescued from the rubble. There is hope that 2 more rescues will be successfly pulled off. But the fact is, what the mayor said last night will probably be true. And his words, quote, the deaths will be very, very high. The death toll, quote, horrendous. So Miles, maybe some of this will become clearer later today. I doubt it though, because once again, I think Gary Tuckman has made it quite clear from those rubble pictures how difficult it is for rescue workers to even get into this area. Miles?
All right, thank you very much, Paula. Undoubtedly, it'll be a very difficult number to fathom. We should let you know that in about 7 minutes' time or so, officials at the Los Angeles International Airport will be holding a news briefing. 3 of the 4 hijacked flights were destined for Los Angeles, and we hope to bring you live coverage of that. That also lies ahead. Let's move now to Capitol Hill. Yesterday on Capitol Hill, a lot of tough talk and at least one touching moment. The tough talk coming from members of Congress vowing for retaliation, singling out Osama bin Laden and his organization as the group responsible for these attacks. The touching moment coming on the steps of the Capitol as members of Congress broke into song, singing God Bless America, a moment I will never forget. Let's turn it now to Kate Snow, where she will tell us about the U.S. House of Representatives going to gavel to session, and a symbolic session, right, Kate?
That's right, and the Senate as well, Miles. At 10 o'clock this morning, they will be gaveling back in here. In fact, they never went out of session last night. Yesterday, they were evacuated, but they technically never stopped meeting, and that's an important point to make. Let me tell you first about the security situation here, Miles. There is a perimeter set up around the United States Capitol, 1 block east and west of the Capitol behind me, 2 blocks to the north, 2 blocks to the south. They're checking IDs. They're letting in people who work in the buildings here, staff, and obviously members of Congress starting now to come back. We have seen some joggers, some people walking their dogs around this area, so we know they're also letting people in on foot. Whether they're going to let tourists into the United States Capitol for tours today is still being decided. Normally there's a huge line of tourists out here by this hour. Miles, this morning there's hardly anyone here in the way of tourists. Let me tell you also that clearly there is an effort to show that it is business as usual here in the Capitol this morning. At 10 o'clock this morning, as we've mentioned, the House and the Senate will reconvene. They will both be in their chambers, at least for a short period of time. The Senate plans to debate a resolution and give 10 minutes to every U.S. senator to speak on the floor. That translates into about 16 hours worth of talk that we're going to hear out of the senators today. On the House side, they're going to come in, they're going to come back a little bit later this afternoon and debate the same resolution. This is a resolution condemning yesterday's actions. We also understand that the House members and the Senate members are going to receive a closed-door briefing at some point this afternoon from intelligence officials, perhaps from the FBI, perhaps from the CIA. All night long, Miles, the dome light on the very top of the Capitol has been burning here. That's because, as I mentioned, the Congress never officially went out of session. That light that you see at the top of your frame is always on when the Congress is in session. It's a technical thing, but it's also a very symbolic thing. Last night that shone all night long. The leadership, as you mentioned, appeared on the steps of the Capitol to send a message. Republicans and Democrats last night speaking with one voice.
We will stand together to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts.
The message has to be that we're going to hunt you down and we're going to find you and we're going to make you pay that price.
America was hit today, but this government of the American people, for the American people, is back up on its feet. And we are functioning, and we are going to go forward together.
The leaders of Congress will meet this morning with President Bush at 11:30 at the White House. We also understand that those leaders were in hiding yesterday for some period of time. There's about 9 leaders between the House and the Senate, 5 from the House, 4 from the Senate, who are the highest ranking people in this body of government. They all went to a secure location. We've learned some more details about that, Miles. 2 by 2, they were taken by helicopter to an underground location. Speaker of the House Hastert was taken earlier in the day, right after the plane crashed into the Pentagon. He was immediately taken away from the Capitol. About 3 hours later, the rest of the leadership was taken to that secure location. They sat together for several hours watching television together, we're told. I'm told by one aide that it was a grim situation, and I'm also told by that same aide that they were a very bipartisan group. This aide saying they're bipartisan now. I expect that will carry over in the business in the coming days. Miles.
CNN's Kate Snow on Capitol Hill, thank you very much. We've just learned that President Bush will be holding a meeting of his national security team in about 2 minutes' time in the Cabinet Room at 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time. He will be making a statement to the media. We'll, of course, bring that to you as soon as we get that videotape, as soon as we capture that. Kelly Wallace is manning our post at the White House this morning from the North Lawn. Kelly, this meeting, they'll be discussing the parameters of response, undoubtedly. Can you give us any insights as to what is being discussed right now?
Well, that is going to be the opportunity for the president to get the most up-to-date briefing on the investigation into who could be responsible for these attacks, as well as for the search and recovery efforts, because a big focus for the administration today is that the administration, the U.S. government, is doing everything it can to assist with recovery efforts in New York, in Pennsylvania, and of course outside Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. So you will obviously hear the president talk about that. In fact, we understand he will be calling on the American people to do their part and to step forward and donate blood. There will in fact be a blood drive here at the White House, a bloodmobile pulling into the White House driveway earlier today. But again, as you noted, a big focus, just who might be responsible for these attacks. Now, Miles, U.S. officials publicly and even really privately not speculating at this time who they think might be responsible. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell on the air earlier today saying that he doesn't think it will be too long before the U.S. government is confident it does know who is responsible. But as we've been reporting, senior officials did brief key members of Congress last night. Some of those members talking to some of my colleagues at CNN, those members saying U.S. officials confident that the evidence right now pointing to affiliates or associates of Osama bin Laden. One other thing I want to show you, Miles, really a picture that sort of captures the mood here at the White House. As you would expect, the flag at half-staff on top of the White House and on top of the Eisenhower Executive Office building. Really a measure and a reflection of the tragedy felt all across the United States on this day. Another note, as Kate mentioning, members of Congress coming over here to the White House to meet with the president. This is an opportunity to show that Democrats, Republicans, all united behind the president. And one other note, security quite tight here at the White House, still very much on a high state of alert. Miles, back to you.
CNN's Kelly Wallace at the White House. Thank you very much. Once again, the president will meet with his national security team right about now, and we should be hearing from them a statement to the tight pool, if you will, of press reporters that will be allowed into the cabinet room at 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time. We will get that to you as soon as we receive it. Let's turn it now to David Ensor, who is in our Washington bureau with a bit of breaking news. David.
Well, Miles, I want to be very careful how I put this, but U.S. officials confirm that 3 planes in the airspace of Western Canada near Vancouver are currently being tracked by Canadian officials, by the Canadian Air Force and ground officials, and it's unclear what these aircraft are up to. They are attempting to ascertain who's flying them, and chances are, officials say, that there's nothing to this, nothing nefarious. You're probably going to hear a lot of these kinds of reports. The airspace of the entire North American continent is now being watched very closely by thousands of people. But nonetheless, we can confirm that there are 3 aircraft that they are still trying, the Canadian officials are still trying to identify, figure out who they are, why they're up there. They expect to very soon be able to report that there's nothing untoward about this, but at this point they are not able to do so. So those 3 aircraft are being tracked very closely, according to U.S. officials, Miles.
David, cognizant of the delicacy of this situation, do we know them to be large aircraft, airliners, or are they general aviation aircraft?
We have no additional information beyond what I've just told you, except to say that it is a tracking effort by the Canadian Air Force, as well as Canadian civilian authorities. Being taken very seriously up there, but as I say, U.S. officials believe they will shortly be able to announce that there's nothing to this, but given the level of alert now, anything like this is being watched closely, Miles.
And David, just to clarify one point in my mind, that unprecedented grounding of all aircraft in the United States yesterday, did that apply in any way to Canada?
My understanding is there were some parts of Canada, particularly along the border, where airports were grounded. A lot of planes were rerouted to there, of course, from the United States. Canada has been very closely cooperating with U.S. officials in the effort to get to the bottom of this and to retrack aircraft if need be. So they are now in constant communication with U.S. officials here in Washington and elsewhere on these 3 aircraft, and as I say, they're hoping to be able to ascertain very soon that there's nothing nefarious to them. But they haven't done so yet. Miles.
CNN's David Ensor, who covers national security for us, joining us from our Washington bureau. And we should just underscore the point that this is a story that is unfolding as we speak, and there will be many dead ends as we go down the road here. Bear with us as you join with us in the news gathering process, if you will. Let's turn it back now to Paula Zahn in New York. Paula.
All right, thanks, Miles. I need to mention that a bunch of us up here on the platform have just sighted what we believe to be a military jet doing some kind of flyover. In light of what David Ensor is reporting, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when he is describing, his report made sense describing the activity in Canada, but this jet was traveling south and slightly east of here appeared, over Fifth Avenue. We have no idea what the relevance of that flight is, but it clearly was a military jet. Some folks on here who are very good at identifying military aircraft thought it was an F-16. We will try to confirm whether it was and what it all means. But right now, I have the honor of joining King Abdullah of Jordan now for his reaction to what has happened here in the United States. Your Majesty, thank you very much for joining us today. Do you have any idea who is responsible for this massacre in the United States?
I think at this stage it is too early to tell. Obviously the international community, Jordan included, is working very closely with the United States to try and come up with some answers as quickly as possible. But I'm sure in a very short period of time we'll be able to identify the individuals or the organizations that were behind this very barbaric act.
What kind of intelligence support are you providing the United States?
Well, many countries in the Middle East, as well as further afield, are working closely together with the different agencies in the United States to compare information. And this is not just because of the crisis. This is something that has been going on for many years. But obviously, everybody's in their offices working night and day to try and get to the bottom of this horrendous crime as quickly as possible.
And in what way is Jordan attempting to combat terrorism right now?
Well, obviously, Jordan has been working very closely with the United States for many years due to the unfortunate experiences that our country have gone through. And we have a very close working relationship between the security services, the intelligence communities of both countries. But again, I think you must understand that on combating international terrorism is actually a combined effort by many countries all over the world, and we're just part of that effort.
As I understand it, you were halfway across the Atlantic on your way to the United States and your jet turned around. What else can you tell us about that?
Well, really, we were almost coming towards the coastline of Nova Scotia when we got the information of the first incident of the first aircraft hitting one of the towers. And as the information began to unfold, obviously we did feel like we wanted to continue to the United States. Air traffic was a problem at that point. And obviously we realized that the government and the federal agencies were going to have their hands full because of the tragic circumstances. So it was better to return home at that point. But all of us here in Jordan would like to share in the sorrow and the grief that has befallen the United States, and in particular the families of the victims involved.
A number of world leaders, including yourself, have condemned this attack. Yasser Arafat yesterday condemning the attack. What is your reaction to some of the Palestinians yesterday in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank who were celebrating these attacks in the United States as a victory against Israel?
Well, I think we were here in Jordan just as shocked as you are, but again, as you said, a small group, and I think this is a small group of individuals that we're celebrating, and in no way is a reflection of the Palestinian people or the peoples of the Middle East. I think all of us are shocked and saddened and distraught that so many innocent people have been hurt or killed in this devastating incident. And we all have families, and just to think of putting ourselves in the shoes of those bereaved ones in the United States, I think has touched everybody. I have friends of mine in New York. I spent yesterday on the airplane trying to call my friends to make sure they were all right. I think all of us have been touched by this incident, and I hope that this is a renewed effort now by the international community to really be able to work much stronger together. There's a lot more that we can do to break down the barriers of cooperation between different countries, try and rid ourselves of this horrendous form of international terrorism.
Your Majesty, do you think U.S. policy in the region made the United States vulnerable to this attack?
I believe that many countries in the world have been target for terrorist organizations. As I said, this is not a phenomenon of this week. The United States and the international community has been battling terrorism for several decades now. And again, it must be pointed out that this is an ongoing battle that happens every day. And I'm somewhat surprised that something like this had not happened sooner. I mean, the law of averages, sooner or later, the bad guys are going to get one through. And you know, we have to understand that. And I hope America has, and I'm sure it will have the strength and determination to pick ourselves up and really take the fight back to the terrorists and those responsible for the heinous crimes that we saw perpetrated yesterday.
So it sounds to me, Your Majesty, and I have to do this briefly, that in essence you're saying perhaps even if, as one of our guests suggested earlier today, peace had been achieved in July of 2000, this still, in the Middle East, this still might have happened.
I don't believe so, because I think that if you had solved the problems of the Middle East, and obviously the core issue is that between the Israelis and Palestinians, I doubt very much that this incident would have taken place. And again, that was a reminder to all of us, and why I think so many of us in the international community have been working so hard to bring a stop to the violence and bring people back to the peace process, because in a vacuum, you do allow the extremists the upper hand and a chance to try things as was happened yesterday. And they will continue on trying until we can solve the problem once and for all.
King Abdullah, it is an honor to have you join us here at CNN. We very much appreciate your time. Thank you again for joining us. Right now we're going to head back to Atlanta, where Miles O'Brien is standing by. Miles, there's been a flurry of siren activity down below. We have no idea, again, what the significance of that is, or the significance of the military jet that made a pass over south early this morning, but we'll try to figure out what all that means and bring that information to you.
All right, Paula keeping us posted from New York. The Pentagon was built immediately after World War II and then stood impervious during all those Cold War years. And today, at least one face of it lies a charred ruin, several hundred people killed as the third aircraft to strike hit yesterday morning. Ken Bacon is a former Pentagon spokesperson. First of all, thanks for being with us, and if you could just share with us your reaction to what you've seen unfold.
Well, I was horrified like everybody else. Friends of mine were in that building, but I think the most important thing to focus on today is that the building is still operating. I understand that 2/3 of the 24,000 people who normally work in the Pentagon are there today carrying on operations, and I think this is a strong symbol of American resolve and resilience.
The attack, obviously, a strong symbol of the defiance of these terrorists. This must in some way shake and rattle the people who work inside that building and all the people they represent in the U.S. military at large.
Well, of course, literally and figuratively shake and rattle, but the fact of the matter is that the people who are in the military today, serving our nation, understand that they're at risk. They understand this when they join the military. This is not the type of risk they anticipated, but they anticipate that they will face risk. I think that the important thing is that they're back at work, they're ready to do their job, and respond to any instructions they get from the President.
As we look at some pictures from lower Manhattan today, as the effort begins there, hard to even comprehend the amount of the Herculean task that lies ahead to find possibly additional survivors, and then of course just begin the forensic process. I'm curious, you've been privy to the behind the closed door meetings that occur in the wake of something like this. What's being said? What's being laid out on the table as the options for the current White House?
Okay, first of all, at the Pentagon itself, there are three priorities: care for the casualties, limit the damage, and maintain operations. And I think that Secretary Rumsfeld's quick run down to the bombed area yesterday showed that he was paying attention to the casualties. Then he went right back to the command center. Right now, what the Pentagon is doing is working with, while it carries on the operations and takes care of the casualties, tries to stop the burning, it is working with the intelligence agencies to try to figure out who's responsible for this, what I consider to be an act of war against our National Military Command Center, and two, to present the President with a list of options that he can invoke, from which he can choose in making a response.
Mr. Bacon, you know, at the risk of doing some Wednesday morning quarterbacking here, if you will, there's been a lot of criticism of the intelligence community in the wake of this. There always is in the wake of a terrorist attack like this. Cognizant of the fact that we talk about, you know, literally the fog of war, do you think there was a misstep? Was there a lack of communication that made this attack possible?
I don't think it's, well, clearly something went wrong. We know that to begin with. But I don't think it's fair right now to point fingers or cast aspersions on any part of our intelligence community. We need to get more facts. We depend on a series of defenses, on perimeter defenses, and one of them is airport security. Clearly there was a lapse of airport security here. But what more happened, what signals we might have missed, is too early to tell right now. What we can say is we as a nation have been working very hard for the last 5 or 10 years to improve our responses to terrorism. We've made considerable progress. Clearly, we have to do more.
If you were still involved in your former role as the spokesperson for the Defense Department at the Pentagon, what would you be advising your bosses to do today and in the coming days?
I'd advise them to do what they've done, to be forthright with the American public, to present information as soon as they're certain of that information.
Mr. Bacon, my apologies. I have to interrupt you. We're going to go to New York now. Mayor Rudy Giuliani with a news conference. Let's listen in.
Good morning. We just completed a long meeting with all of the agencies of the city, state, governor, participated in it, and the Port Authority, so that we can work on the things that we have to do today to, first of all, focus our efforts on recovering as many people as we can and save lives. Second, try to begin the removal of debris to that area of the city, which is going to be a task that goes on for at least 2 or 3 weeks. And then focus on the other issues that are of importance to the city. Make sure that food comes into the city, make sure that people are able to go about their lives and are taken care of in the hospitals, and to try to bring the city back to normal as soon as possible. And we're going to aim to try to do that for the rest of Manhattan starting tomorrow. And we'll be focusing on that and trying to accomplish that all day today. We have been successful in recovering at least one other person, Port Authority police officer. We're hopefully going to be able to recover a fourth one, and we're in the process of doing everything we can to try to locate other people, and that'll be the major focus of our attention. We'd also appeal to since some came forward late yesterday and last evening. If they do, please contact the police department and the FBI, because it could be of enormous help in the investigation of the case. We're going to try to open schools tomorrow. We're hopeful that we'll be able to, we certainly will be able to do it in the entire city, and we'll be working on a plan for the maximum number of schools that we can open on the east side of Manhattan, particularly the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Con Edison is working, I think, as intensely as they possibly can to try to get power restored. It's going to take some time, and we're bringing generators in. The governor made available to us a group of generators that we've moved to Randall's Island, and we will be using them in that area of the east side that needs generator power, because they may need it for quite some time. We were able to move 120 dump trucks out of the city last night, which will give you a sense of the work that was done overnight. So some of the debris has already been removed. More of it is being removed, and it'll be done by barge all throughout the day today. The subway system is operating in all of the city, but below 14th Street, and largely because right now we have that closed. So if you're in any of the other 4 boroughs, public transportation is normal, the subways are normal, the buses are normal. If you're in Manhattan, the subways are going to be working to 14th Street, and then for those that go underneath, they'll just go straight out to Brooklyn. As soon as we can get that area of the city open, however, there will be subway service there, except for the 1, 2, and 3 lines, the West Side IRT below 34th Street, because of the collapse that took place. And again, we ask all New Yorkers to cooperate and to try to help each other. There are going to be a lot of people today who need help and need assistance, either because of the fact that they know people that were lost in this terrible tragedy, or because they're just frightened of what may happen. If you could comfort them and help them and assist them, particularly elderly people, that might be a way in which you can contribute. And we're getting very, very close cooperation from the state, from the federal government. I think people in New York, the best way they can deal with this right now is not only to deal with their own grief, which we all feel and have, but to show that we're not going to be in any way affected by this, that we're not going to be cowed by it, that we're not afraid, that we're going to go about our business and lead normal lives and not let these cowards affect us in any way like they're trying to do, which is to instill fear in us. Governor?
Mayor, thank you. As the mayor indicated, the focus right now is still on search and rescue in the hopes that we can get other people out of the debris and save more lives. We have, at last count, 18 different search and rescue teams down there. And I want to thank my colleagues. We have 8 from Connecticut that Governor Rowland sent in, others from around the country. We have a specialized team coming that Governor Calderon is sending from Puerto Rico. And it's this type of support from around the country that is allowing us to get through this. I have to tell you, I was down at the scene last night, and Mayor, your police and fire not only were heroes at the beginning, but they're still heroes. They're down there under enormous personal strain and risk. I saw them at the ground zero while a high-rise was on fire right across the street that could have collapsed, and they are risking their lives to try to save their friends and their colleagues and the New Yorkers who are still trapped. And we have to thank them, say a prayer for them. This is a time for rescue, it's a time for commitment, but it's also a time to reflect and grieve for those who didn't have their parents come home last night, or for those who still might be lost. And we will get through this because, as the mayor indicated, New Yorkers come together in times of crisis, and we've seen tremendous spirit donating blood, volunteering at hospitals, helping us to get through this. And we have done everything we could to be supportive. We have National Guard troops here now. We are mobilizing fire departments from Westchester and Rockland that are backing up in the Bronx. We're mobilizing fire departments from Nassau and Suffolk that will help in some of the outer boroughs on Long Island. But what we don't need are people just simply coming in to volunteer. We have the hotlines, we have the organization, we have tremendous coordination between the city and the state and the federal government. So people who want to exercise their expertise, whether they're firefighters, they should contact the fire department. If they're EMTs or nurses, they should contact the hotline that we have set up at the state, where we've already had about 10,000 calls. So this is a tragic episode in American history, but New Yorkers will get through this. America will get through this. We will not be intimidated. We will not lose our freedom.
What is the status of the World Trade?
One other thing that we should do. These are the flight recorder boxes that the firefighters and the police officers and the rescuers are looking for, and we're going to we'll give you copies of this. We'd like you to put it out as broadly as possible. We're giving copies to all the rescue people and recovery people so that they can try to find them. Altogether there'll be 4, 2 for each airplane. And that's what they look like, except it'll be obviously covered with soot and dirt. But there are a lot of people involved in the recovery and relief effort who know what they're looking for, and then there'll be some that don't. So if we can give those out, it would be very important. This morning's meeting was devoted to the relief and recovery effort, largely, This afternoon, we're going to focus on the economic recovery of the city and work with the hotels, the restaurants, the real estate industry. We're going to rebuild. We're not only going to rebuild, we're going to come out of this stronger than we were before. And in addition to having wonderful people in New York, as the governor indicated, we also have the strongest business community of any place in the world. And we're going to call upon them, and we're going to need their help. But we're going to come out of this emotionally stronger, politically stronger, much closer together as a city, and we're going to come out of this economically stronger too. And we're going to start working on that right away.
What's the status of the World Financial Center? There appears to be a fire burning across the street now, fairly significant.
I believe. You want to answer that, Richard? The FBI.
The smoke from the World Financial Center was from a defective generator that the fire department worked on. There was no major fire at the World Financial Center.
A statement from the FBI. The FBI.
I'll make a brief statement. Obviously, as you all know, this is a pending criminal investigation. I can tell you that it is being coordinated by Director Mueller at FBI headquarters. We have essentially all 56 field offices in the country involved in this. There are primarily a dozen offices where the airplanes were hijacked and left. We're doing a lot of things as far as at those particular airports, checking on the planes, checking with crews, cleaning people. All of that is ongoing as we speak. Probably the major thrust that we are doing right now is we do have the manifest. We're reaching out to all of the families, interviewing them, and the primary purpose of that is obviously to get any information. You have had, in the media has reported, there's been a number of calls made from these various planes. We would like to put out to the people, if they haven't reported that to law enforcement, to call their local law enforcement or FBI so we can get a hold of it. The obvious thrust for us right at this particular point in time is to identify the number and the individuals who were in fact hijackers. So that is the major thrust. We will be doing a crime scene. The primary thing is, as the mayor just pointed out to you, is the black boxes. We're working with the city, but again, that's going to follow the search and rescue, ongoing intensive investigation. That's all I have at this time.
Can you say anything about the arrest in Florida and the seizure of a car in Florida and the seizure of a car?
We have a number of leads that we're running around the country. A number of these, I'm not going to get into specifics other than it's my understanding we did detain some individuals over in New Jersey. Essentially, we are finding out that that is not all that relevant at this particular point in time, but I'm going to limit my comments. That is going to any of the investigative news pertaining to this investigation will come out of Washington, D.C.
Is there anyone in custody at this time? Is there anyone in custody at this time?
Other than the ones that I just mentioned to you, there are some over in New Jersey. That's the only.
Mr. Mon, can you explain to us, Mr. Mon, how airports, airlines that have been hijacked could come into the New York area without being detected by radar, without the route that they were taken being questioned by people in Transcon or radar?
I can't really answer that. That would be FAA and NTSB. I'm not going to get in. I don't know the answer to that.
Did you have any warning at all that there were hijacked planes in the air?
No, I can tell you this was a surprise. As the mayor and the governor has pointed out, it was a surprise, a shock. We had no forewarning of this happening.
Mr. Mon, there were reports that the FBI was investigating a hijacked plane just before the first plane hit the World Trade Center. Is that true?
I'm not aware of that.
Do you have any sense at this point of the range of potentially of people that were in the World Trade Centers and that are still missing or presumed dead? What is even the conceivable range that there is at this point?
The numbers that we're working on are in the thousands. Obviously, we hope that's not the case, but the estimate would be for both of the buildings that although building number 2 had a chance to clear out. A lot of people probably cleared out of building number 2. Building number 1 had some time to clear out, but there were areas of it that were affected. The best estimate that we can make, relying on the Port Authority and just everyone else that has experience with this, is that there'll be a few thousand people left in each building.
Mr. Mayor, you talked about...
And then our recovery relief efforts and our work with the medical examiner are premised on those kinds of numbers.
Mayor, can you explain, if there are thousands of bodies and there were 120 trucks of debris taken out, where are the bodies if there's only 41 confirmed fatalities? Where are the rest of them?
A lot of the debris that was taken out are structural things that were in the way of the relief effort. I don't know that the debris was actually taken out of the actual buildings that fell. But if some of you haven't been down there, but the area was very constricted by lots of structural damage and things that were in the street. So a lot of the debris that was taken away, I suspect, was the debris that blocks the entry and exit of the vehicles that have to go in and out of there. Altogether, I think so far, we account for about 45 bodies.
So are the other ones still buried in the debris?
I imagine that that's the case, yes.
Are there still sounds of life? Are the rescuers hearing with listening devices? Are they still hearing signs that there are people alive?
The rescue workers do have listening devices. They also have dogs with which they're searching. And we're making every effort to get the people out of there.
Are there indications that there are people alive, though? In other words, are they hearing things with the listening devices, or are the dogs hitting on scent?
I can't say at this time.
Is there any way to approach the area through a
Is the city
tunnel?
still on a heightened state of alert today?
Absolutely,
And
yes.
how long will it remain in effect as far as the emergency?
It's going to last until further notice.
Commissioner, could you explain to us why there are so many trucks around?
The World Trade Center, putting the towers back up as a symbol of anything right now?
There's no question we're going to rebuild. I can't say that we know the exact nature yet of how we're going to do that, and we'd like to meet with lots of people.
Any belief that the skyline will be whole again?
The skyline will be whole again. Exactly, what will be there, I think we have to leave to giving some people some time to consider it and to think about it. And also, the reality is that the people in New York City are going to be whole again. We're very, very strong.
Is there any sense of the cost at this point, and the state, the city, the federal government is paying for the relief efforts?
Governor?
In my view, that's the last thing you think about at this point. We're not concerned about who's picking up the tab. We're just doing everything we can to try to make sure the relief efforts are the strongest possible. And we'll sort out the costs and the economic consequences later.
Is there any way to try to approach through the subway tunnel to perhaps people trapped in the areas below? Is that conceivable to do? Is that I have no idea. Is that something that could be tried?
Excuse me?
To try to approach through a subway tunnel to get perhaps...
They're looking at every access area to that area, the rescue workers.
Has that been tried as far as you know?
No, specifically, I don't know, but I'm sure they're looking.
Last question. Mr. Mayor, could you tell us...
The police officer and where he was trapped? How he was trapped?
We now join the chaplain of the Senate as he prays along with members of Congress as they get about ready to open a session. Okay, unfortunately, as you can imagine, with the amount of stuff going on here today, we don't have that sound, but a session of Congress is about to get started. The chaplain presiding over a prayer right now. I'm Paula Zahn reporting from New York this morning. I wanted to quickly bring you up to date on what the city of New York is facing this morning. Mayor Giuliani just held a news conference along with the governor of New York, George Pataki. They say their goal right now is to rescue as many people as they can and to save lives. The good news, according to Gary Tuchman, and these numbers go back and forth, you need to understand that it is very difficult to get confirmation of this, but Gary Tuchman has gotten closer than any other reporter to the perimeter area of the World Trade Center. he has had confirmed for him by some city officials that in all 9 people have been rescued from this horrendous rubble you're looking at right now. 6 firefighters, 3 police officers, and there is hope, Leon and Darren, that 2 more people will be rescued sometime this morning. Leon, Darren?
Paula, thank you very much.
Good morning, Paula.
I'm Darren Kagan at CNN Center in Atlanta.
And I'm Leon Harris as well. Good morning, folks. You're now looking at a live picture we're getting from the House. This historic joint session of Congress about to get underway.
As they attempt to fill the gaping holes left in the fabric of this nation, send forth your Holy Spirit upon all the members of Congress, the President, and all government leaders across this nation. Free them of fear, any prejudice whatsoever. Remove all doubt and confusion from their minds. So with clear insight, which comes from you and you alone, reveal all that is unholy and renew the desire of your people to lives of deepening faith, unbounding commitment, and lasting freedom here where liberty has made her home. We place our trust in you now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces the House's approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. The Speaker at this time will lead the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Due to the events of yesterday, the Chair wishes to announce that the joint meeting to receive the Honorable John Howard, Prime Minister of Australia, scheduled for today will not take place. The Chair wishes to acknowledge, however, the presence of the Prime Minister here today and extends on behalf of the House his appreciation for the solidarity of the Australian people and the presence of the Prime Minister today in this very difficult time. Thank you. This time, the gentleman from Texas wishes to be.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to announce today's schedule.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, as you have directed, the House is convening now. We will stay in session from now until 11 o'clock, where members will have time for 1 minute. At 11 o'clock this morning, we will take a recess until 12:30 while the chamber is cleared. Members of the body will be invited back to the chamber at 12:30, at which time we will have a member briefing on the floor that will last until 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Gephardt and I will call up by unanimous consent a joint resolution to condemn yesterday's terrorist acts. That resolution will be addressed by this body under that unanimous consent request with an understanding that we will continue to address it until each member of this chamber has had ample time to address this issue as he or she sees fit. I want to thank all the members of this body for their patience, their commitment, their understanding, and their resolve during this trying time. And let me assure you, Mr. Speaker, by the time the 435 members of this body have spoken today, the world will have no doubt about who we are, what we will stand for, and what we will not stand for. And I yield my
We're listening in on the House of Representatives. Over the next hour, they will each be spending 1 minute each talking about and condemning the violence that hit the United States yesterday. They will then gather at 12:30 for a briefing that will take place behind closed doors, a briefing on the investigation into the violence and the terrorist attacks on the United States. We'll go back to this. Our coverage continues with Leon.
Yeah, in addition to the words that the congressmen are saying today, the symbolic message of business going on in Washington is the main message they are trying to give to the world right now. In New York, however, it is a little bit more than business as usual there. Let's go down and check in with our Martin Savage, who's there at Ground Zero. He's at the World Trade Center down there on the ground this morning. Marty?
Leon, we just finished a tour that was put together by the New York Police Department and the Fire Department that allowed members of the media to get right up to the epicenter of what is this great tragedy, not only here in New York City, but throughout the world. It is hard to imagine that the Twin Towers soared at one time 110 stories. All we could count of one of those towers was about 7 stories. It was cut off. There is a huge mass of twisted steel and concrete that really, really drives any sort of depiction as you try to explain it. It is smoldering and smoking and burning. And one of the things that strikes you as you get so close to the heart of this is how quiet it is. In part, the reason for that is the tremendous amount of ash that covers the ground as if there had been some huge volcanic eruption. It muffles everything as if you were in the middle of some giant snowstorm. Instead, though, it was something far more treacherous and far more tragic. Many of the crews and fire teams that you see there are standing around. There is only limited access. There is only very minute efforts that they can make for fear of moving in any way the huge pile and possibly forcing it to collapse more. Those that have been working on that pile say the incredible thing is how deep it goes, because of the collapsing floor and floor and floor actually drove the building deep into the basement, some believe even beyond. We also saw robots that are being brought in, small track-like devices that obviously they hope to use to sneak through any sort of crevasses or any sort of voids that may hold the opportunity for life. There was not jubilation when there were those that were rescued from the pile. Instead, it was very somber, it was very quiet, and they realized there is a lot more work to be done. Leon?
Well, Martin, have any of the officials that you've spoken with given you any sense of how realistic it is that they will find more survivors today?
Those that you talk to say that they believe there is still a chance. However, when you walk up to the building, when you see how great the devastation is, it is not only clear to a viewer's mind, but also clear to those that try to rescue. The chances are increasingly slimmer and slimmer. Still, there is hope, and the work goes on, and the two combined are what are inspiring the rescuers today. Yeah.
And Martin, how about the situation with the fire? Any idea what it is that is continuing to burn some 24, 25 hours later, and how soon they think they can get that fire out?
Well, it is hard to say because the math is just so great. It's perhaps the fact that everything that was in the building is now smashed deep into the ground, and that there is a lot of material that is still possible to burn, and with the fire not being directly exposed to air, it's more smoldering than it is. You don't see leaping flames, you don't see open flames at all. So it appears that that's part of what's at work. Also, you have to remember there were several hundred automobiles and vehicles that were in the area that were crushed and demolished. And there, too, you have rubber tires that are burning. There was even a threat of gasoline and diesel fuel that they were worried about. So there is plenty of material that is left to burn, and it still does burn in a gray brown smoke that rises above a drastically changed New York skyline. Yeah.
And it also means there's plenty of sad but urgent work to do as well. Martin Savage reporting live for us this morning from the World Trade Center, from what used to be the World Trade Center. Darren.
And as rescue efforts go on in New York City, rescue teams also standing by at the Pentagon, and that's where we find our Bob Franken. Bob, I understand you have some new information for us.
Well, I have several things. First of all, of course, this is a story so huge, and we talk about it in terms of institutions, when really this is the story, the human story as it is in New York, it is here too. CNN's Pentagon producer, Chris Plant, has just walked through the Pentagon, through a substantial portion of it, and he had some interesting things to report. You can see, of course, where the plane collided with the Pentagon a little bit over a day ago. Well, now that the firefighters have spent that day trying to put out the flames, he's reporting that they have not been entirely successful, and as a matter of fact, the fire has spread a little bit. The plane hit on one of the outer rings, as you can see, but Chris Plant reports that it has now spread to the inner rings. It's gone around to my left, your right as you're watching, and you can see that the flames are going in that direction. Plant reports that there are actually some fires still in the roof area, and that the area around the inner ring has some spot fires, that type of thing going on. That, by the way, has been confirmed by some of the firefighters who have been out here. We are also told that the entire Pentagon, all floors of it, seem to be at least covered in soot, and there's a smoke on the walls throughout all of the floors of the Pentagon. As a matter of fact, even the areas that were not directly affected, like the secretaries' areas, have been in effect abandoned. The secretaries, the leaders of the Pentagon, have gone down in the basement where they're operating right now, and of course trying to keep the military operation going. As far as the search for the casualties here, it's very dangerous right now. We're told by the people who are in charge of that it is so unstable they can't decide whether to try and knock down the wall where the plane hit or restabilize it somehow. These are the decisions that are being made. It's very, very risky now. When they do go in, it's very dark. They worry about tripping and they worry about a collapse. So this is a story of individual courage, and as huge as it is, it's a number of individuals trying to see just how successful they can be, finding somebody who survived, although one fire official told me highly unlikely, but he said we're not going to give up. That would be despair. Leon?
Actually, it's Darren, Bob. You mentioned the talk with the firefighter, but is there any indication that people might still be alive inside the Pentagon?
They have found nobody yet. They have found that there are some bodies. They have not been recovered. There are really a wide variation in the number of casualties we'll have. The best guess is it might be 100 or less, but the estimates have gone much higher than that. Thus far, no sign of survivors, particularly in the area where the plane hit. None are expected to be found, but there, in fact, have been some casualties spotted, not removed, but spotted.
Bob Franken at the Pentagon. We'll be checking back with you throughout the morning. Right now, back up to New York City and Paula.
Thanks so much, Darren. I just wanted to quickly recap for you what we know at this hour. As we've been reporting all morning long, all the public schools are closed, the private schools, the parochial schools are closed. But the Securities and Exchange Commission has now told CNN that the SEC chairman believes that the financial markets will indeed open for trading on tomorrow. However, an official decision has not been made at this moment. Right now I want to go to Gary Tuchman, who is as close as you can get to what is left of the World Trade Center for an update on rescue operations underway. Gary, what do you got?
Well, yesterday morning at this time, the tallest buildings in New York City, the second tallest buildings in the United States, stood in the street just a couple of blocks behind me. And now the skyline here on this street, Church Street, looks like it did back in 1971, before the World Trade Centers were built. That beige building was there in the early 70s and the late 60s and the 50s, and that's what it looked like if you were here in New York City before that. It's a very strange sight indeed, not seeing those gleaming 110-story buildings behind me. We just saw a very disturbing sight on this area where we're standing. These are all emergency workers here right now, police. We have members of the military who are here. We have other emergency officials. And just a couple of minutes ago, you're going to look right now. This is one of the disturbing sights. There you see a car that was incinerated in the parking lot of the World Trade Center. It's very hard to look at those sites and imagine what happened to the people who were nearby. We've seen a lot of cars like that today. This truck right here that just passed by has wreckage from the World Trade Center, but an even more disturbing sight about 5 minutes ago, we saw a vehicle from the medical examiner's office carrying body bags. We can tell you we haven't had any good news whatsoever in the last couple of hours about survivors, but there have been 9 survivors found. And with us right now are 2 of the gentlemen who worked with one of the survivors. Gentlemen, can you come over here for a second? This is Brian Van Flander. This is Steve Martinez. They're emergency medical technicians. I want to ask you, Brian, you told me that you loaded up onto an ambulance a police officer who survived this terrible tragedy. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a transit authority officer, we worked on them for, when I say we, I mean the EMS, the firefighters. Those guys were just incredible down there. They worked on him for a better part of 4 to 5 hours. He was only extricated maybe an hour and a half ago. And the reason it
while he was still in the wreckage?
Yes. We actually, as I understand it, and I didn't actually get the chance to see him in the wreckage.
You put him in the ambulance.
That's right. I loaded him in, helped many guys load him in. They crawled down into, he was in a pit, and they had to crawl down next to him or beneath him and physically cut a cable that had punctured his ankle, as I understand it.
Was he talking to you as you put him in the ambulance?
He was lucid. He was aware. He wasn't. He was talking, but not. Kind of thumbs up. There was a nice big round of applause as we got him on the stretcher, and then again when we got him into the ambulance, and people were. It was actually a very tearful moment, a very touching moment. Kind of shows the best of New Yorkers. I mean, these guys are just working their hearts out. They're trying to save their fellow colleagues.
Also touching what you have in this box. Show me what you have in it.
Yeah, well, we found this at Ground Zero. There's 3 command stations. We're at Liberty 1, which is about as close as you can get to Ground Zero without being in a pit. And we found Herb just lying outside amongst the rubble. The carnage, I know you guys hear everyone coming out of here saying the carnage is unbelievable, but it's just beyond comprehension. You cannot possibly imagine the devastation down there. And this kind of tells a story unto itself.
Tell me what you're going to be doing with this.
Well, I'd like to clean it up and give it to a young girl in memory of the people who died, and maybe when she's old enough she can appreciate.
Hard for you.
Yeah, a lot hard.
How are you coping right now, sir?
I'm all right. I'm fine. It was rough in there, We went in. Basically, we provided EMS services for the fire department and the rescuers, the people who were digging. They were having a hard time breathing, having a hard time seeing with their eyes.
You can see that the rescuers have their masks that they wear. Yeah. Anyone in this area is supposed to be wearing these masks.
Yeah, so there's a lot of crap floating around in the air, and it's rough in there. We had firefighters pass out on us. We had to give them oxygen, things like that.
Are you scared?
Yeah, it was scary a few times in there with the fire and all that. Then there was one point where they thought they had found somebody, so they called EMS in, and we ran in. And that's when we really got a really good look at it, because from the outside, it's a lot of hilly rubble, and you don't get to really see it unless you're in there digging. And when they called EMS in, we ran in and actually really got to finally see what it looked like, and it was just chaos. It was chaos, and also it wasn't nothing but a couple of DOAs down there that they took out.
Dead on arrival. Gentlemen, a country thanks you for your service.
You are.
We appreciate it. We have one more gentleman over here. If you can come over with us, sir. This is a member of the Guardian Angels, the crime prevention group, who was crawling through the wreckage for many hours. Can I get your name, sir?
Bill Coscarelli.
Bill, tell me what your experiences were at the site just a couple of blocks behind us.
Well, like he was saying before, my mayor thing was yesterday night. I started, when the fire went down a little bit, I started to get into the buildings, over the basements, over the fire station, looking for people. I have a hard time finding people that want to come with me. Finally,
would-be rescuers who wanted to come.
Yeah, rescuers or firefighters. The firefighters that were mainly on top of the building, and basically nobody wanted to leave the top of the building. I went on there. I went to the path train. Basically, I went to the station.
Which is the commuter train in the bottom level of the building.
Yes, exactly. I went all the way down to the station looking for people.
What did you see, sir?
Everything is. I mean, it's no roof. Is basically. It's nothing left from the building. It's a 60-feet hole where the building collapsed, and everything is there.
Sir, I want to thank you for joining us and talking to us. Appreciate your help. You can see it's an extremely stressful, very troubling situation. They are hoping to find more survivors, but right now, officially, we know a total of 9 survivors have been found. Paula, back to you.
All right, well, it is absolutely chilling to hear these first accounts of what it is like for rescue areas to go into Ground Zero. As you may remember from last night, rescue workers weren't even allowed into the area till very late because of concerns about debris continuing to fall, the fumes that continue to come from the crash site. We will, I am sure, continue to hear more of these horrifying accounts of what it is like for the rescue workers that are going in there. We do need to make it clear there has been some positive news this morning. Some of those very brave rescue workers have, in fact, according to Gary Tuckman, rescued some 9 folks trapped inside the rubble, 6 city firefighters and 3 police officers, and the hope is that 2 more victims trapped inside the rubble will be rescued. One of those victims actually establishing cell phone contact with a family member. It is hard to imagine, by looking at these pictures, that anyone ever could have survived the strength and the force of this kind of attack. But the mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, expressing the hope that there might be more people trapped inside the rubble. We know from FEMA Director Joe Alba that 8 specially trained crews, urban rescue crews, will be on the site at some point later today to assist all the paramedics and the rescue workers on the scene right now. The mayor unable to give us any sense of what kind of fatalities we're looking at. All he will say is that the numbers will be very, very high. One city official telling me those numbers could climb into the thousands. I wanted to remind everybody that President Bush is in the process of meeting with his cabinet secretaries, and we are hoping that sometime within the next 45 minutes or so, at what is expected to be the conclusion of these meetings, that we'll have a little more information for you on that. So from New York, let's go back to Leon in Atlanta.
All right, thank you very much, Paula. You know, so many of us had thought for so long that the Twin Towers were invincible. We had heard for so many times over the years that the buildings had been built to withstand an impact from a crash of a plane. Well, let's talk right now on the telephone with Aaron Swirsky. He is in Jerusalem, and he was one of the original architects of the complex. As I understand it, is that the case, Mr. Swirsky?
Yes, I was working with Minoru Yamasaki, which is the architect of the building, but I was one of the workers with him, and we were a team of 14, 15 architects, and I was one of the members of the team, yes.
Well, as a member of the team and having such insight into how this building was constructed, could you believe that a plane could bring these buildings down?
No, as a matter of fact, one of the rationales of the structure of the building was that it would be built as a pipe, and that proved itself to be a worthwhile thing in the explosion of 1993, when a hole was brought into the building. It survived, but somehow nobody could foresee anything like that. At that time, also in 1962. The planes were not like this type of planes that we have now. There were, I think, the biggest plane was a 100-passenger plane, something like that, and the fuel capacity of those planes were not like it's today. And the criteria was that if a plane hits it, it would go right through it. And I mean, so nobody could foresee something like that, and that the tower was protected in such a way that the damage would be limited to one story, but it wouldn't travel to the other stories.
Well, then let me ask you this then. Can you draw in your mind any distinction between the two factors here? Which made the bigger difference, the size of the plane here or the amount of fuel that the planes were carrying?
Excuse me, I lost the connection.
Sure, I understand. You're saying that the planes that were in design or that were in use at the time that these buildings were designed were smaller planes. They only carried 100 passengers or so. The planes that crashed yesterday were much bigger than that. They were 767s or 757s.
And also the fuel capacity it's much more tremendous. I mean,
exactly, and that's what I want to ask you about. Which was it that made the biggest difference? Was it the impact felt from the larger plane, or was it the heat that was generated by the burning of that much fuel?
Well, I imagine, when I saw the pictures of the implosion of the buildings, it looks like the fuel must have leaked right through the core of the building, and from there, the massive explosion is what caused the building to collapse. So it was something completely unforeseen as far as the design criteria was.
Let me ask you one final question, if I may. Considering what you know about the building, you say it was constructed like a pipe, these two buildings, and the manner in which we saw them collapse, does that give you any hope at all that perhaps the way it collapsed, there will be more pockets inside at the bottom where survivors could be found?
Well, I sure hope so. We pray that there will be survivors and that this won't happen again. And I mean, it's a terrible, terrible, incredible tragedy. Yeah.
Aaron Swirsky, we thank you very much for your insight this morning.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Take care. Darren.
Leon, yesterday's events hasn't just shocked people here in the U.S., people all around the world. And when something like this happens to a member of NATO, the entire organization takes action. NATO has just wrapped up a meeting in Brussels, and our Andrea Koppel's at the State Department in Washington, D.C. with more on what NATO members had to say about yesterday's events. Andrea.
Darren, far away from the scenes of carnage in this country, in a very different setting in Brussels, we're told by both diplomatic and State Department sources that the member states of NATO are right now sitting in a room going over a draft document. This is the first time in NATO's history that they would do this, that would give the United States an upfront guarantee that if and when they're able to figure out who in fact was behind yesterday's attacks, that NATO, all 19 states, would guarantee the United States any kind of military support it needed, whether it be logistical, intelligence, the right to fly through their airspace. All of this would be taken care of and would be in the waiting. It would be at the ready for the United States if it chose to ask NATO for its support, that NATO would in fact then give the U.S. that support. And this is being discussed right now at NATO headquarters, the first time it's being done under something known as Chapter 5 of the NATO Charter, and it's something that Secretary Powell, in fact, alluded to this morning when he said that he spoke with the head of NATO, Lord Robertson. He also spoke with the head of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and with the head of the EU, Javier Solana. So right now, Darren, the United States, with the help of its European allies, member states of NATO, are laying the groundwork for a possible military retaliation if and when the U.S. is able to determine who is behind yesterday's attacks. Darren?
Andrea, this would be hugely significant. Basically, as I understand it, it would be NATO saying to the U.S., if and when you decide to retaliate, we're giving you a green light and the support to do whatever you feel is necessary.
Absolutely. This would be the first time in NATO's more than 50-year history that anything like this has taken place. Remember that during the crisis in Kosovo and the Balkan War most recently, this took place off NATO soil. These were not member states of NATO. This is the first time in NATO's history that one of its 19 members has been attacked directly on its own soil, and for that reason, we're told the United States is getting the backing of NATO, and they're discussing this draft document right now that would lay the groundwork up front for the United States to use all of NATO's various military intelligence and whatnot, all of its resources to attack, if that decision is made, those responsible. But again, they need to make sure, first of all, that this was not something that was homegrown here in the United States, but in fact something that happened or was directed from overseas. And that's certainly what we've been hearing both President Bush and Secretary Powell allude to, that their intelligence is leading them to various places overseas.
And once again, this would still be at the discussion stage, Andrea?
Well, right now we're told there is a draft document that is on the table right now in Brussels that all 19 members are discussing, and it's our understanding from both State Department and diplomatic sources that this is something that could very well be approved in the very, very near future in a matter of hours.
All right, we will have you track that. Andrea Koppel at the State Department. And now back up to New York and Paula.
Darren, I'm actually going to focus my attention on a development out of Boston this morning. The Boston Globe is reporting that investigators in Boston have found a copy of the Quran, a videotape on how to fly commercial jets, and a fuel consumption calculator in a pair of bags that was apparently meant for American Flight 11, which of course crashed in the World Trade Center yesterday. The Boston Globe said that the suitcases belonged to a man with an Arabic name who investigators believe was one of those who hijacked the plane and crashed it into the World Trade Center. Right now, I want to check in with Bill Delaney to provide some perspective for us this morning on this story. First of all, is the Boston Globe the only one going with this story?
Well, actually, it's the Boston Herald, in fact, Paula, that's been leading the way on this story as hundreds of federal, state, and local investigators fan out to try to determine who hijacked these planes. It was the Boston Herald, their entire staff of dozens of people thrown into this yesterday, who broke a lot of this important news this morning in their overnight edition. I have with me one of the reporters on that staff, John Wells. John, what did the Herald learn about the hijackers involved in these two planes that eventually crashed into the World Trade Center?
Well, what we learned rather late last night is that authorities have identified 5 suspects of Arab men as possibly involved with this, that 2 of them may be brothers. Another 2 of them apparently traveled into Boston from Portland, Maine, originating, authorities think, in Canada, and that they also seized an automobile here at Logan Airport out of the central parking garage, a Mitsubishi sedan. And apparently within the sedan were pilot training manuals, or a manual that was in Arabic. This is what we're told by reliable law enforcement sources here in Boston, which, you know, it speaks to there's some roots to this in Boston, which not many people are aware of, but it speaks to the idea that there may be a terrorist cell in Boston.
It was in the late 90s, the FBI said earlier this year, that there was a small, possibly just 2 men linked to Osama bin Laden here in Boston. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, there are 2 men. They're both cab drivers who have been, have alleged ties to bin Laden, who lived here in the 90s. One of them has since been killed in Lebanon. The other one has a death sentence over his head in Jordan, I believe. And they were linked around the time of the millennium. They were gone by then, apparently, from Boston, but they were linked to some plotting around the millennium for terrorist bombs in the U.S.
A security source I spoke to this morning, I must say, because we do have to be cautious about these reports, somewhat scoffed at the idea that someone who was heading to a hijacking, who was going to fly that plane, would bring with him a manual about how to fly an airplane. What do you make of that?
Understandable that he would have that reaction. This is raw information that we're getting from reliable law enforcement sources. We're not in the business of selecting out things that seem unlikely. You know, he may be right. I don't know. We're going with the best information we have right now, and things are changing quickly.
Why Boston?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about that. Geographic location, close to New York, close to Canada. If this is true, that there is some cell that's linked to a cell in Canada, a cell here in Boston, that's logical because travel is easy from across the border. I think that there's been talk also about that Logan has a spotty security record. So there's been speculation that terrorists would think this is a good place to stage something like this, although there's been no information regarding that.
The FAA in the late 90s finding some 136 security violations here, fining the airport $178,000, a spotty record at Logan.
Yeah, and I'm hearing today also that, you know, Logan workers are coming out and on the radio talk shows and talking about how horrific they feel the security is there, and that they've known it for years. And one of them said today that he comes to work at Logan Airport at 5 a.m. He could drive a tank in here. This is how some of those workers feel. So there's clearly a problem that needs to be addressed. Obviously, a little bit late.
John Wells of the Boston Herald, thank you very much. This still unfolding story, as I said, hundreds of investigators fanning out to try to determine how hijackers hijacked the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center yesterday that originated tragically in Boston. Back to you.
Bill, it's interesting now that you have both the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald essentially reporting the same thing. I also found it interesting that the head of the Massachusetts, or the aviation director of the Massachusetts Port Authority is saying that when Logan reopens, that, quote, there will be very significant security changes, including no more curbside luggage check-in and a ban on anyone except registered passengers passing checkpoints. That sounds to me that the spotty record that you were talking about was, well known and well established.
It's been a problem here for years, I have to tell you. They also have had their security successes here, but there have been notorious cases. For example, 2 summers ago, a teenager managed to get over the fence surrounding Logan Airport. He was dressed as an Hasidic Jew. He got over a fence with razor wire on top of it. He went to a 747, got into it, and made his way all the way to London, a notorious case here 2 summers ago. So yes, Logan has had problems over the years. On the other hand, even the FAA report from about 2 years ago, which blasted Logan, said that for a major airport, the violations here were really no more serious than they found at many other major airports. Logan